Lifespan Psychology and Developmental Theories. Chapter Outline 1.1 Psychology and Human Development, 1.2 Themes of Development, 1.3 Major Theories and Theorists, 1.4 Context and Settings of Development, 1.5 Lifespan Development as a Science, Research Methods. What does psychology say? You've been looking forward to your trip to New York City. Upon landing at JFK Airport, you take the subway to reach Midtown Manhattan. The train accelerates and you watch the platform disappear as you find a seat and take your first look around the car. There is life here, rocketing through the underground tunnels and a broad cross-section of human experience. You steal glimpses of your fellow riders' physical appearance, belongings, interactions, and facial expressions. You wonder where each of them is going and what they hope to accomplish today. At each station, the train stops, and some people exit and even more bored, the crowd growing as it nears Manhattan. Like many students studying lifespan development, you likely share a curiosity about the people around you. You may wonder, what are the ideal environments for people to develop and flourish in? How and why are these different for different people? How straightforward is the path through life's journey? Are there twists and turns, detours, and backtracking? What kinds of changes can we typically expect across the lifespan? Are there particular points in time during the lifespan where certain experiences are essential to development? How does an individual perceive and respond to expectations from their social and cultural environments at different points in their life? How much variation should we expect to see from person to person, group to group, culture to culture, as we attempt to uncover patterns of development across the lifespan? In this course, you can explore questions like these, contemplate what answers can be found through psychological research, and learn more about your own life journey. 1.1 Psychology and Human Development. Learning Objectives. By the end of this section, you'll be able to describe the similarities and intersections between the fields of psychology, lifespan development, and human development. Identify major questions of interest and topics of research within the field of lifespan development. Differentiate between the various domains within the field of lifespan development. Jose's 18-year-old son, Landon, is about to graduate from high school. The family has taken several road trips to visit various colleges around the region, touring each campus and attending a football game with a particular interest in each school's marching band, given Landon's dedication to the trombone. So far, Landon has only expressed interest in 2 schools. Both have more than 30,000 students, an exciting campus atmosphere, and large marching bands. Hosea knows his son, though. Landon is quite capable of accomplishing just about anything he sets his sights on, but often needs prodding and a bit of time to get started on a new goal. Hosea worries about the size of the 2 campus communities. Will Landon get lost among the crowd? Who will keep him on track? And then there's the fact that Landon doesn't know what he wants to study. Hosea also wonders how his own role as a father will change and what the right level of support to provide his son will be. What will he do for a new exercise hobby now that Landon, his best disc golf partner, is moving away? All these thoughts flood Hosea's mind as he navigates the morning commute. Hosea is grappling with various worries and uncertainties related to Landon's impending graduation and transition to college. The study of lifespan development is focused on uncovering the psychological processes behind transitions like this. These processes help us to understand and explain individual situation and concerns at a moment in time, as well as in all humans across the entire arc of the lifespan. As we seek to identify those connections and commonalities, we also find differences based on the wide variety of individual experiences, environmental conditions, and cultural backgrounds that make up the varied tapestry of human experience. We begin our journey into lifespan development psychology by defining the field, including its scope and relationship to other areas of science, outlining the major questions The discipline is concerned with studying and previewing the components of an individual's psychological development. Lifespan development as a field of study. In studying lifespan development, you'll encounter several related scientific areas, often referred to as fields or disciplines, that are sometimes discussed nearly interchangeably. Let's first situate lifespan psychology within the broader science of psychology, and then examine the meanings of the different terms for the field of study. Psychology. The scientific study of the mind and all the behavior it produces is psychology. This is a short and simple definition, but it covers nearly the entire range of human experience. It recognizes that the mind plays a central role in human functioning and is the origin of all behavior and the center of all our responses to our environment. Our mind, believed to be located within our brain, helps us to both shape and react to the world around us through our behavior. Behavior consists of physical, observable actions, things like riding a bike, cooking dinner, or texting a friend. Behavior is driven by affect and cognition, both of which are not always easily observable. Affect is a more precise term for emotional experience, which includes not only our feelings and moods, but also the ability to discern or understand others' emotional states. Cognition is the scientific term describing all of our thinking abilities, such as memory, computation, imagination, and language. If you can think it, feel it, or do it, psychologists study it. Its broad applicability in studying much of the human condition, psychology is notable for how it bridges previously separate areas of intellectual inquiry. Founded as a scientific discipline in 1879 by Wilhelm Wundt in Germany, psychology was meant to apply the scientific method to the big questions of human experience that philosophers had pondered for thousands of years. For example, are humans fundamentally good or bad? Do our early life experiences dictate our destiny? What is the nature of love? Do humans have free will? And what is consciousness? For nearly 150 years, psychological science has attempted to objectively answer these and thousands of other questions. Along the way, more than a dozen major subfields in psychology have emerged, including clinical, social, cognitive, industrial, organizational, health, and developmental psychology. Lifespan development and human development. The term lifespan development is another name for the subfield of developmental psychology. These terms describe the scientific study of growth, change, and stability in humans and the processes that underlie that growth and change, from conception until death, or colloquially, womb to tomb. Growth most often refers to maturation, which is typically biological and includes, for example, all the changes in height, weight, and physical characteristics that the transition to adolescence brings. Maturation refers to growth in psychological characteristics as well, like the expansion of vocabulary and social skills that occurs throughout childhood. Lastly, it is important to recognize that change is nonlinear and can occur in both directions, whereas stability is characterized by an absence of pronounced change. Figure 1.2. Lifespan development is the study of people from womb to tomb or from cradle to cane. The main idea is that we continue to grow and develop in interesting ways throughout our lifespan, however long that may be. Developmental psychologists look for patterns of stability and investigate the biological, psychological, and other mechanisms that create stability in our behavior across time. Stability can be further defined as the state in which characteristics and abilities remain the same or function similarly across broad portions of the lifespan. For example, a young child who is shy in social situations may also show signs of social inhibition as a teenager and adult, even making a career choice that allows them to work behind the scenes instead of being the focus of attention. As you will learn, the concepts of temperament and personality helps us understand why the way someone approaches the world often remains consistent across the lifespan. Human development, closely related to lifespan development, is a perspective that incorporates a multidisciplinary approach to understanding the development process. In fact, some universities host academic departments separate from the psychology department that focus on human development. The main difference between the two is human development's emphasis on the broad scope of factors that influence development. Specialists in human development often engage with theories, perspectives, and findings from other disciplines such as anthropology, medicine, communications, history, economics, and law. The human development perspective helps remind us that human development is complex and is best understood using as many tools, perspectives, and levels of analysis as possible. The contemporary study of human growth, change, and stability across the lifespan has embraced this multidisciplinary perspective, whether it is called lifespan development or human development. The history of lifespan development. Perhaps surprisingly, while lifespan development is a subfield of psychology, scientific and philosophical inquiry into the nature of human development, especially of children, predates psychology's establishment as a formal scientific discipline. The child study movement, which united disciplines such as education, social work, and public policy to focus the scientific community's interest in child development, arose during the progressive era of the 1890s, shortly after psychology's founding. However, one of the earliest published scientific accounts of child development had appeared nearly 100 years earlier. This was the work of French physician Jean-Marc Gaspard Itard, who conducted a case study of a boy who had spent his childhood without human contact. The case of Victor, the wild boy of Aveyron, continues to spark interest more than 2 centuries later. Through his work with Victor, Itard was able to begin exploring many of the fundamental questions that lifespan development concerns itself with today. So, we can trace the field of lifespan development to at least the start of the 19th century in Europe. Older roots lead back to ancient Greece around 400 BCE. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and many other philosophers were fascinated with the same questions that contemporary developmental psychologists study. Today, we are fortunate to have a sophisticated set of science-based tools to help us uncover ever more precise answers. As a scientific field of inquiry, lifespan development asks several fundamental questions, most of which are related to the passage of time. Exploring what changes we expect to see, when those changes occur during the lifespan, and how they come about is of central importance. Lifespan developmentalists are not content with simply describing and explaining human development across the lifespan, however. They want to make that knowledge applicable. Professionals from other fields, including medicine and healthcare, education, public policy, senior care, social work, the nonprofit sector, and even toy design, are also keenly interested in taking theory and research findings from developmental science and using them in everyday life. This highlights the scientific goal of application, the process of translating evidence-based research and ideas into practical solutions to influence and improve life. Developmental psychology, as a scientific discipline, advocates for public policies and interventions to be based on evidence derived from scientific research. For example, once developmental science made clear that the reasoning abilities of teenagers, including risk assessment and reward-seeking behavior, are heavily swayed by peers, public policy agencies around the United States changed driving regulations to explicitly limit the number of non-familial teens who could be present in the car with a teenage driver. Figure 1.3. The allure of a text message can override a teen's developing ability to assess danger, a stark reminder of why evidence-based policies like restrictions on teen passengers are vital for road safety. Does money really buy happiness? Think about the age-old question of whether money can buy happiness. At first glance, it seems like it should. If you had enough money, you could purchase the necessities of life and then some: a nicer home, better means of transportation, or more leisure time or activities. One approach to answering this question is to study the relationship between income and subjective well being, a personal sense of satisfaction and happiness. In various countries across the globe, data consistently show that subjective well being rises with income. At the same time, however, researchers found that above a certain level of income, roughly 90,000 USD per year, the relationship between income and subjective well being leveled off. That is, a certain amount of money was necessary to satisfy wants and needs, but beyond that, earning more money began to have a diminishing influence. A recent re examination of the data looked more closely at this question by classifying participants by their reported level of emotional well being. Those scoring low on emotional well being were placed in one group, those scoring in the middle in another, and so forth. When examined this way, the findings revealed three main conclusions. First, for those with low reported emotional well being, there is indeed a steady increase in happiness with increasing income up to about $100,000 per year, and then leveling off. Second, for those with a reported medium level of emotional well being, the direct and proportional relationship between happiness and income continued across the entire income spectrum, meaning this group of individuals continued to get ever happier with increased income. Finally, those individuals with high levels of emotional well-being showed an intensifying relationship between happiness and income after about $100,000 per year. In other words, happiness increased even more when earnings increased. Psychologists point out that money is not the only factor related to subjective well-being. Other factors such as self-esteem, strong relationships, social support, and a sense of freedom and optimism play a role. Throughout this course, you'll explore many of the psychological factors and processes that promote life satisfaction. Psychological domains of the developing individual. When we think about the myriad sources of influence on an individual's development, we immediately recognize how complex the task of understanding someone truly is. Likewise, the psychological makeup of a person is very complex. Emotional experiences, internal motivations, and needs, temperament, personality, and a dozen or more major thinking skills domains all have developmental pathways, even as they are shaped and influenced by one another. When we add biological growth and maturation, including the unfolding of each person's unique genetic blueprint over time, answering the question, why is this person the way they are, can be daunting. Psychologists have devised a way to study developing individuals by looking at several major functional areas. These areas of development are biological, cognitive, social, emotional, and personality. This resource is organized along these functional lines by covering each period of the lifespan across two chapters. One chapter focused on biological/physical and cognitive developments, and another chapter focused on social and emotional developments, including the development of personality. Together, the two chapters for each life stage paint a complete picture of developmental psychology's theories and findings. In many instances, a topic like eating disorders, for example, may be covered in the physical and cognitive discussion, even though there are clear social, emotional, and personal aspects to the development of eating disorders. While this separation is useful for organizing our study of lifespan development, keep in mind that there are many intersections across areas. Figure 1.4. Note that developmental psychology sometimes refers to social, personality, and emotional topics as psychosocial development, to highlight the way these areas overlap with cognition and mental processes. Figure 1.4. The overlapping domains of development include an individual's biological/physical, cognitive, and socio-emotional processes. 1.2. Themes of development. Learning objectives. By the end of this section, you will be able to explain the difference between continuous and discontinuous development. Describe nature and nurture as sources for developmental change. Explain the importance of the timing of opportunities for development. Maya, who is in her late 40s, never understood the draw of social media. She put off creating a Facebook account until she found herself missing out on information about her niece's school shared via Facebook groups. Now she finds herself reconnecting with old friends and acquaintances from high school and neighborhoods where she lived, almost like a virtual reunion. She's fascinated by how people have both changed and stayed the same. Maya's college girlfriend, who swore that she never wanted children, is now a mother of 4, but she held to her goal of joining and eventually running her family's business. Maya's timid high school classmate took a leap and now lives an adventurous life as a travel writer. But the writer part doesn't surprise Maya at all. She always turned to this friend for support on school papers. To a developmental psychologist, such a scenario is endlessly fascinating. People often have a natural inclination to wonder about how people from our past turned out. The field of lifespan development has established and advanced several themes and questions to focus this curiosity and exploration. These themes look at the form of, sources for, and timing of developmental experiences and achievements. Continuous versus discontinuous development. The first theme that helps organize the way we think about the nature of development over time is the shape of developmental change. Theories about this developmental change are often called stage theories. A stage theory attempts to explain why we may observe brief periods of rapid development followed by longer stretches of stability. Stage theories give us an idea about the nature of change as well. Relatively abrupt change is likely to be more apparent and cause us to wonder about its source or mechanism. When we observe a gradual day-by-day or week-over-week progression of change, we see continuous development. Many topics in the field of lifespan development show a continuous pattern of development. For example, vocabulary growth across the toddler and early childhood years show a dramatic but smooth progression of growth in the number of words a child produces. However, early psychological theorists such as Jean Piaget and Erik Erikson, whose work you'll learn about throughout this course, noted that certain cognitive and personality characteristics seem to develop in intermittent fits and spurts, or stages. For a period of time, the developing individual has one set of capabilities, such as a toddler who communicates in 2-word utterances, and then, rather abruptly, a reorganization takes place, and the individual is transformed. Seemingly overnight, that toddler begins speaking in complete sentences. This is discontinuous development, a change in developmental kind, form, or degree that does not directly follow from what came before. Some developmental progressions may appear to be discontinuous, such as the sudden change of puberty. However, when researchers consider the biological changes that prepare a body for the growth spurts of puberty, such as hormone changes, we begin to see that continuous development patterns are also present. Figure 1.5. In contrasting theories, development can be viewed as continuous or discontinuous. Continuous development is conceptualized as a gradual, ongoing process, whereas discontinuous development is marked by distinct, stepped stages. Whether a characteristic appears to follow a continuous or discontinuous pattern, an underlying assumption in developmental psychology is the idea that development is progressive and proceeds from basic forms of a characteristic in early life to more advanced forms later. That is, development moves forward. From this perspective, moving backward to an early stage or a lower capability, a process termed regression, is a sign that something may be wrong. In order to promote early child development, major organizations like the United Nations International Children's Emergency Fund, UNICEF, and the World Health Organization, WHO, have made it a priority to educate caregivers about the importance of psychosocial development. For example, poor nutrition can lead to delayed physical growth and poorer long-term health. However, interventions that provide nutrition supplementation in early childhood can help children catch up on physical growth and improved health outcomes. Sources of developmental change. We now turn to the theme for which developmental psychology is best known: the relationship between nature and nurture. You may also hear this referred to as the nature versus nurture debate. Suppose we observe a developmental change, such as a growth spurt in height, or a state of stability in an individual, such as having a consistent, outgoing personality, and their genetic blueprint appears to be the reason for it. In that case, we argue that nature or biological forces are directing the changes or working to keep the characteristics consistent. On the other hand, if the impetus for change seems to come from outside the individual, whether it be a physical or a social aspect of the environment, such as engaging in a new hobby or growing up in a certain family dynamic, then we argue that nurture, the environment, is the reason. For more physical and psychological characteristics, the source for developmental change or stability is rarely nature or nurture alone. Instead, developmental psychologists focus on the complex and fascinating ways that nature and nurture combine and work together to direct change and stability across the lifespan. Figure 1.6. A father and son, side by side, mirror the growth of the trees they walk through. Development and change are influenced by both biological and environmental factors. Heritability. Until a few decades ago, the field of psychology often explored the question of what caused developmental change by asking whether it was nature or nurture. Due to advances in the discipline's methodologies, findings, and theories, we now think in terms of nature and nurture, recognizing that most development has both genetic, nature, and environmental, nurture influences. In fact, nearly every psychological characteristic is composed of a combination of biological, genetic components and environmental influences. The amount of influence from genetics and environment varies depending on the characteristic. Today, psychologists work to discover exactly how much each source contributes. The extent to which the genetic component explains difference is called a heritability estimate. A good example of how nature and nurture both contribute is the timing of the onset of puberty. It is determined via the combined influence of nature and nurture, given that both biological determinants, nature, like genes, and environmental elements, nurture, like nutrition, can trigger its emergence. Closely related to our thinking about the relative contributions of nature and nurture is the concept of reaction range, figure 1.7. This is the idea that our genes likely set upper and lower levels for particular traits, behaviors, and abilities, as well as how sensitive these are to environmental forces. One example to consider is general intelligence. While scientists have yet to fully identify the specific genes responsible for intelligence, we know it is not solely determined by genetics. Environmental factors are of equal importance. However, it is difficult to directly measure the impact of these environmental influences because researchers cannot ethically manipulate a child's upbringing to observe the effects on their intelligence. Although the application of reaction range to intelligence remains largely theoretical, it serves as a useful way to conceptualize the complex interplay of genetics and environment in human development. It reminds us that both nature and nurture contribute to who we become. Figure 1.7. Although the contributing factors combine in complex ways not fully understood, researchers agree that both genes and environment play roles in the development of intelligence. Gene-environment correlations. Another way developmental psychologists try to discern the relative contributions of genetic and environmental influences is gene-environment correlation. Gene-environment correlation describes the complex interplay between our genes and the environment we experience and encompasses three main types: passive, evocative, and active. The passive type occurs when a child inherits genes from their parents that influence the environment in which they are raised. For example, parents who enjoy reading are more likely to read to their children regularly and have many books in the house. The evocative type explains how our genetically influenced behaviors can evoke reactions in others, shaping our environment in turn. For example, parents are more likely to take their child to the library if they notice the child enjoys reading. The active type refers to how our genetic tendencies guide us to select specific environments. For example, a child joins a book reading club at school because they have a passion for reading. Studies of twins and adopted children have shown that our genes play a role in shaping the environments we experience, highlighting that what seems like environmental influence may actually be partly due to our genetic makeup. Epigenetics. A breakthrough concept over the past few decades called epigenetics also explores the complexity of the nature and nurture question, as well as the level of sophistication in our current thinking about how best to answer it. The process of epigenetics explains how an individual's behavior and environment can cause changes that affect the way their genes work. Biologists, neuroscientists, and psychologists alike now recognize that environmental influences can modify an individual's genetic expression. There is evidence that stressful environments can trigger a chemical tagging of someone's DNA. For example, trauma experienced in childhood, like growing up in a highly stressful home environment, violence-ridden neighborhood, or a war zone, could make someone sensitized to and highly reactive to signs of conflict later in life. More specifically, the genes responsible for building the brain systems that regulate our stress level could be altered. The nature and nurture question is as fascinating to explore as it is complex to answer, and it underlies just about every topic of inquiry studied by lifespan psychologists. Windows of opportunity for development. In addition to studying what changes are expected and how they occur, developmental psychologists ask when we should expect certain skills to develop, and whether there are windows of opportunity for these that affect developmental outcomes. Is it possible to speed up development if we introduce an experience at just the right time? Is it possible to hinder or even prevent the development of a particular ability or characteristic altogether, such as speech? What are the impacts of highly enriching environments? What are the impacts of being deprived of certain experiences, such as human contact? Scientists have learned that across nearly all psychological characteristics, humans are highly adaptable. They observe normative developmental outcomes, meaning those that are typical or expected, across a wide range of environmental conditions. Certainly, there are optimal environments for these developmental outcomes, but good outcomes occur even in suboptimal circumstances. This is central to resilience, an individual's capacity for and process of adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, or even significant sources of stress. It takes extreme deprivation to severely restrict the developing human's potential, as well as such deprivation occurring at specific developmental times. In other words, resilience is common and lifespan development principles can be applied to increase the likelihood of resilience. A critical period is the developmental age range in which certain experiences are required for a psychological or physical ability to develop. For example, it appears that exposure to human speech is necessary in the early years of life for typical language development. Consider the 1970s case of Jeannie, a child who was severely neglected and isolated to the point that she was rarely spoken to. Upon her rescue at age 13 years, Jeannie faced the monumental task of learning a language, a primary task of infants and toddlers. with an adolescent, post-pubescent brain. Jeannie became the subject of intense study and remediation efforts by doctors, speech pathologists, and psychologists. Despite her extreme early deprivation, she made many improvements in language comprehension and speech production. However, her development of language differed markedly from what is normative. For example, language production and comprehension happens in the left hemisphere of the brain for the vast majority of humans, but Jeannie showed processing of language in her right cerebral hemisphere. A sensitive period describes an age range during which the development of a characteristic is particularly amenable to inputs and influences from the environment. For a critical period, certain experiences are necessary for normal development, whereas having certain experiences during a sensitive period makes an advantageous situation for ideal development. For example, a sports coach would want to know about normative periods for growth spurts in males and females, especially the typical wide variation around puberty. Not only could this awareness of timing help with training young athletes, but it could inform injury prevention practices. A faith-based youth leader working closely with a group of teenagers would want to understand that the adolescent period is a time of identity exploration and desire to fit in with peers and plan activities accordingly. A social worker employed by an assisted living facility knows that residents might be concerned with life review and may develop a scrapbooking activity to support the process of reflection. Physical development, identity exploration, and reflections on past life can occur across the entire lifespan. What's notable across these three examples is that each takes on more importance at a different stage in life, when the opportunities for impact on development are greatest. This is the concept of the sensitive period. Variability and diversity of development. In this course, you'll learn about numerous theories, topics, and research findings based on the developmental experiences of many thousands of people. It is sometimes easy to confuse or conflate the broad results of studies with individual life histories. Scientific ideas about development represent statistical averages for development outcomes across many, but every individual is unique and has their own life history, one that may show varying degrees of similarity to and deviation from the findings presented as normative in this discipline. For example, when you learn that two-word utterances typically appear around 18 months, a reader might recall, "My child did this when they were 12 months old." The fact that this individual's development doesn't perfectly fit the finding does not invalidate the overall research. What's more important is the pattern or sequence from one-word utterances to two, and that this development occurs within a typical time frame. The midpoint of thousands of examples with a range of variations on either side. While lifespan psychology attempts to uncover what is typical for all humans, psychologists recognize and allow for the inherent variability of a single individual's development. Variability in development can occur on a cultural level. For example, research compared Dutch and Israeli parents and found cultural differences in how they promote their babies' motor development. Israeli parents encouraged more tummy time, believing it helps babies develop faster. Dutch parents were not as likely to encourage their infants spend time laying on their tummies. Interestingly, the Israeli babies who got more tummy time and stimulation from their parents showed better crawling skills than the Dutch babies. This study highlights that different cultures have different approaches to parenting, and these choices can influence how babies develop. 1.3. Major theories and theorists. By the end of this section, you will be able to describe the major theoretical perspectives of lifespan development, connect each theoretical perspective from the themes of lifespan development, list the similarities and differences among the major theoretical perspectives, provide examples of developmental concepts present in the lifespan. Shanae is in her late 20s and is several years into her career as a marketing consultant for a communications company. She finds life busy and fulfilling and enjoys both the challenge of her job and the new city she lives in. However, she is concerned about her childhood friend, Georgia. Georgia visited Shanae last weekend, and the two went out to several dance clubs to meet up with some of Shanae's new friends. Amid all the fun, Georgia confided in Shanae that she wasn't happy with her current job, didn't know what career path she should pursue, and that her last relationship ended poorly. Sad and confused, Georgia seemed directionless and asked Shanae to give her advice. Shanae wants to help her friend, but doesn't know where to begin. All human beings are complex. As individuals, we are collections of thousands of traits, capabilities, roles, relationships, and behavioral tendencies. Each of those characteristics grows, changes, or shows remarkable stability over the course of a lifetime. And the developmental trajectory of each characteristic is itself influenced by dozens or even hundreds of genes, experiences, and gene-environment interactions. In short, humans are multidimensional and impacted by a multitude of influences. Because of this complexity, lifespan development employs many theoretical perspectives and relies on research methodologies from multiple scientific disciplines. This multi-perspective, multidisciplinary approach aims to give us a full and accurate understanding of human functioning. As you learn about some of the major theoretical perspectives or frameworks for understanding human behavior throughout the lifespan, there will be different perspectives to explain development and behavior. Instead of seeing these as contradicting each other, these varied perspectives can be considered together to enhance our understanding of how human behavior evolves over the lifespan. Even when two theories may seem diametrically opposed, there are often ways that they can be seen as complementary explanations of different areas of development. Psychosocial theory of development. Erik Erikson, Figure 1.8. Erik Erikson, Figure 1.8, was born in Germany in the early 20th century and became a teacher and psychoanalyst. He worked with psychoanalyst Anna Freud as each practiced and strove to further Sigmund Freud's foundational theory of psychosexual development, which outlined a series of stages that children navigate in their personal development. When World War II approached, Erikson moved to the United States and spent time in South Dakota. As a result of his training in psychoanalysis and his cultural experiences, he proposed a highly influential update to Sigmund Freud's theory. Figure 1.8. Erik Erikson proposed the psychosocial theory of development. In each stage of Erikson's theory, there is a psychosocial task that we must master in order to feel a sense of competence. Erikson called this a psychosocial theory of development, which views human development as occurring in a discontinuous or stage-like fashion as we resolve increasingly complex and age-graded challenges posed by the social environment. The theory highlights the way the developing mind, the psyche, is embedded within the society, the social part of the theory's name. With an intricate back and forth between the changing demands and expectations of society and the mind's responsive transformation. Erikson's theory was the first to consider the entire lifespan. The 8 stages of life he outlined now form one of the organizing frameworks for the study of lifespan development. In Erikson's view, as an individual enters each successive period of the lifespan, society presents a new challenge called a psychosocial crisis for the developing individual to work on, Table 1.1. For example, a toddler aged 1 to 3 years is learning to operate independently, which allows them physical independence from their caregivers. Successfully mastering this crisis results in the toddler having autonomy. Society, as represented by parents and other caregivers, has a vested interest in keeping the child safe during this early phase of life. Erickson called this struggle or tension between the child and society's expectations the autonomy versus shame/doubt stage. The child spends 18 to 24 months working to gain a basic sense of self-control while negotiating this achievement with their caregivers. In this way, Erickson proposed that personality development is an interaction process between an individual and society. Each stage affords the opportunity to achieve another level of psychosocial mastery, beginning with trust in our first year and culminating in a sense of integrity. Stage 1, age 0 to 1. Developmental task, trust versus mistrust. Description, trust or mistrust that basic needs such as nourishment and affection will be met. Successful mastery, trust. Stage 2, age 1 to 3. Developmental task, autonomy versus shame/doubt. Description, develop a sense of independence in many tasks. Successful mastery, autonomy. Stage 3, age 3 to 6. Developmental task, initiative versus guilt. Description, take initiative on some activities, may develop guilt when unsuccessful or boundaries overstep. Successful mastery, initiative. Stage 4, age 7 to 11. Developmental task, industry versus inferiority. Description, develop self-confidence and abilities when competent or sense of inferiority when not. Successful mastery, industry. Stage 5, 12 to 8. Developmental task, identity versus confusion. Description, experiment with and develop identity and roles. Successful mastery, identity. Stage 6, 19 to 29. Developmental task, intimacy versus isolation. Description, establish intimacy and relationship with others. Successful mastery, intimacy. Stage 7, age 30 to 64. Developmental task, generativity versus stagnation. Description, contribute to society and be part of a family. Successful mastery, generativity. Stage 8, age 65 plus. Developmental task, integrity versus despair. Description, assess and make sense of life and meaning of contributions. Successful mastery, integrity. Cognitive perspectives. The cognitive perspective in developmental psychology emphasizes the study of mental processes and how they change over time. Key figures in this area include Jean Piaget, known for the stage theory of cognitive development, Lev Vygotsky, who emphasized the role of social interaction in cognitive development, and information processing theorists who examine how the mind processes information like a computer. Stage theory of cognitive development. Swiss biologist Jean Piaget is famous for contributing theories regarding changes in cognitive ability that occur as we move from infancy to adulthood. He spent his early years as a scientist studying various animals. He then worked on creating some of the earliest measures of intelligence. As he was writing test items, he interviewed children and asked them to explain the thought process behind their answers to sample questions. One of Piaget's early insights was to focus on the children's incorrect answers because they provided a window into their reasoning abilities. From these observations, he developed his prominent stage theory of cognitive development. Piaget's theory, like Erickson, is an organizing framework for the modern study of lifespan development. Piaget's theory views development as occurring through a series of age-based stages, Table 1.2. As we age and our brain and bodily systems mature, we are afforded new ways of interacting with the world. The combination of these new physical and sensory capabilities with the new experiences the environment offers drives the development of thinking abilities that are acquired across the 20 years or so of life. Along the way, individuals are active participants in their own development, testing out ideas and capabilities in the world and formulating a coherent sense of how the world works. Piaget's emphasis on the active nature of learning and development, his focus on the reasoning behind wrong answers, and his delineation of the psychological processes occurring in cognitive development made for a groundbreaking theory. Table 1.2 Piaget Stages of Cognitive Development. Age 0 to 2. Stage sensory motor. Description world experienced through senses and actions. Developmental issues. Object permanence, stranger anxiety. Age 2 to 6. Stage preoperational. Description use words and images to represent things, but lack logical reasoning. Developmental issues. Pretend play, egocentrism, language development. Age 7 to 11. Stage concrete operational. Description understand concrete events and analogies logically. Perform arithmetic operations. Developmental issues. Conservations, mathematical transformations. Age 12 plus. Stage formal operational. Description formal operations utilize abstract reasoning. Developmental issues abstract logic, moral reasoning. Sociocultural theory of cognitive development. Russian psychologist Lev Vygotsky explored learning and cognitive development in children during the early 20th century and demonstrated how important social interaction is for learning and growing. He died in his 30s, and his work did not become widely known outside of Russia until the 1970s, when his theory became very influential in the field of developmental psychology. Vygotsky proposed a sociocultural theory of cognitive development, emphasizing that thinking abilities are embedded within an individual's social and cultural context, whereas Piaget's theory focused on a person's step-like journey of coming to understand the world. Vygotsky saw cognitive development as supported and propelled by social tools available to the individual learner. These social tools include language, direct support from others, and technological aids. Vygotsky then was among the first to recognize that language guides cognition and gives shape to ideas that can be readily communicated with others through words. One such example is private speech, whereby the learner may use words to audibly or not keep themselves on track during a difficult problem-solving session. If you've ever rehearsed a list of grocery items out loud while you search for a place to record them, you've used language in such a way. Acronyms for remembering complex math concepts, such as PEMDAS, parentheses, exponents, multiplication, division, addition, and subtract, for the order of arithmetic operations, are another example of language use supporting cognition. The application of various forms of technology, another social tool, can allow an individual to perform complex tasks more easily than by relying on brain power alone. From this perspective, using a calculator to do basic calculations frees up the mind to think about the more important and complex parts of a word problem. For example, word processing programs and apps that autocorrect spelling and grammar support thinking by allowing the writer to focus on the ideas of the message instead of on the mechanics of writing. Vygotsky is best known for championing social supports in propelling cognitive development and educational achievement. His notion of the zone of proximal development states that all of us are capable of thinking and achieving at a higher level than we may realize. There are concepts and ideas just beyond our current abilities that we are ready to master if only we have a little help, often from others. Educators and parents have used the idea of scaffolding to help learners achieve beyond their current level, gradually withdrawing support as the student becomes more competent. Learning how to ride a bicycle Learning how to ride a bicycle is a great example of scaffolding. Support for learning this difficult task can come through training wheels or from a caregiver holding the bicycle seat while running alongside the child. As the child gains a sense of balance and masters the mechanics of pedaling and steering, the training wheels become less necessary and are eventually removed, and the caregivers let go of the seat. The child has reached a new level of development with guided and temporary support. Information processing theory. Our digital age has also brought new ways of thinking about how the human brain works. Although the computer was conceptualized via ideas about how the human brain functions, psychologists now use the functioning of a computer as a metaphor for understanding how we think. From the 1960s onward, the metaphor of information processing has been a helpful way to think about cognition and cognitive development. One key concept is that of information flowing into the brain, being processed or acted on, and then leaving the brain in the form of behavioral output, just like data in a computer. This concept also relies on a modular view of the brain, the idea that discrete structures within our brain specialize in various cognitive tasks, such as memory, sensory processing, language comprehension, and spatial reasoning. As information flows into the brain through various senses, it is routed to the appropriate brain region and acted on, and then behaviors emerge through actions and words. From a developmental perspective, cognitive development is fostered as the various parts of this information processing system mature and gain operational efficiency. While the information processing model is useful, it has also become more simplistic as science has progressed. Our brain indeed has many functional modules that are connected and share information back and forth. The advent of brain imaging technology brought insight into further complexities of how the brain and its cognitive abilities are organized. Cognitive neuroscience. Advancement in computing technology ushered in increasingly sophisticated ways to image or view the brain. At first, technologies such as X-rays and CT scans were used to make images of brain structures. Often, researchers would correlate brain injuries and loss of functionality with changes seen in these images. The invention of MRI, magnetic resonance imaging, scanning made highly detailed imaging possible. Finally, an innovative software development allowed many such images to be made quickly and spliced together into a real-time video of the brain at work. This technique is called fMRI, or functional magnetic resonance imaging. Together, these are imaging tools that psychologists working in cognitive neuroscience use to connect brain structure and function with behavior. Scientists can now see which areas of the brain become more active when participants solve math problems, thinking about a romantic partner, or perform a memory recall task, among many other fascinating findings. Figure 1.9. Periodic brain scans allow researchers to observe the effects of learning and mastering a challenging task over time, and to look for changes in connectivity among various brain regions as individuals age. The Dallas Lifespan Brain Study, DLBS, is an example of the advances made by using these technologies to think about the aging brain. For example, contrary to the expectation that brain changes and symptoms of Alzheimer's disease and other forms of dementia begin in late adulthood, research from DLBS has shown a steady relation between changes in the brain and a decline in cognitive function beginning much earlier in adulthood. This provides hope for advancements in the identification, prevention, and treatment of these diseases. Figure 1.9. Psychologists use fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, to learn more about which areas of the brain respond to different stimuli. Biological and evolutionary perspectives. It can be difficult to distinguish between fields that study the interaction of genes and the environment, such as the fields of evolutionary psychology and behavioral genetics. In both fields, it is understood that genes not only code for particular traits but also contribute to certain patterns of cognition and behavior. Evolutionary psychology focuses on how universal patterns of behavior and cognitive processes have evolved over time, whereas behavioral geneticists study how individual differences arise in the present through the interaction of genes and the environment. When studying human behavior, behavioral geneticists often employ twin and adoption studies to help provide insight into the relative importance of genes and environment for the expression of a given trait. Many of the most influential early psychologists and developmental theorists were medical practitioners or had some form of training in biology. It is no surprise then that various biological principles and methodologies have come to play a prominent role in thinking about human development, including evolutionary factors, behavioral genetics, and ethology. The study of animal behavior is called ethology. Developmental psychologists who use this approach study animals, especially other mammals, as models to discover and test ideas relevant to understanding human functioning. In the 1930s, England, John Bowlby used his medical and psychoanalytic training to research the experience of children growing up in orphanages and similar institutions. Even though these children had all the physical necessities for health, clothing, shelter, and food, he was concerned by the emotional and social effects he observed. Using these observations and his findings from animal studies, including rodents and monkeys, Bowlby formed the theory of attachment, an enduring, emotional, significant bond that forms between two individuals, often in a caregiving context. The development of at least one attachment, the basis of human bonding, is essential to human development. Bowlby's discovery of this necessary component for human flourishing opened a new area of developmental inquiry with far-ranging consequences for individuals across the entire lifespan. How does attachment in childhood carry across the lifespan? You've likely heard that what happens in childhood has lifelong consequences. In many ways, the field of lifespan development can be proud of the pervasiveness of this idea, in that it can help to focus attention, priority, and care on child development. Of course, this idea does not mean that childhood experiences define our destiny or that experiences later in life do not matter as much in comparison. Attachment is the enduring bond that develops between child and caregiver. The quality of this bond depends on the pattern of interactions between these individuals. How sensitive has the caregiver been to the child's physical and psychological needs? How responsive has the caregiver been in addressing those needs? And finally, how consistently has there been a match between this sensitivity and responsiveness? When there is a history of consistent, sensitive, and responsive caregiving, a secure attachment develops. If one or more of those dynamics is missing, various forms of insecure attachment may develop. The functional purpose of this enduring attachment bond is not just the emotional and physical support that comes with being nurtured, but also a sense of security that allows the child to venture forth into the world and explore. This exploration supports other aspects of human development, including cognitive, social, and personality domains. The quality of the early attachment bond carries forward to future significant relationships. A child's expectations of what a relationship is, what it is for, and how others will behave toward them are informed by that first attachment bond. The impact of stability of attachment across the lifespan has been well documented. For example, attachment quality predicts how far of a distance a young adult is comfortable traveling to attend college. Secure attachment predicts the ability to move farther away from home, as well as academic success once at college, with a more secure attachment history predicting better academic success. Attachment quality also has connections to later life stages, such as when the now adult child becomes the caregiver for an elderly parent. A secure attachment history is related to an increased desire to care for the elderly and the amount and quality of caregiving provided. Despite these findings, suggesting remarkable stability across the lifespan, a central feature of attachment theory is the ability for an insecurely attached individual to reapproach attachment quality by forming a significant relationship with a securely attached person at any time in life. That is, a person with a secure attachment history can provide a model for an insecurely attached person to emulate, thereby changing that person from that point forward. So, do childhood experiences lead to lifelong consequences? Indeed, they do. But humans have a remarkable capacity for change, growth, relearning, and development, as shown through the example of attachment theory. Evolutionary psychology. The approach of evolutionary psychology looks to the theory of natural selection to explain the emergence, development, and persistence of various psychological characteristics in humans. Natural selection posits that long ago environmental conditions favored those with certain physical and psychological characteristics, making them more likely to survive and be able to reproduce. These individuals could then pass on their genes coded for those characteristics to their offspring. Across many generations, the characteristics that conferred such a survival advantage became part of the species' genetic package. Examples of human functioning that have been studied from an evolutionary perspective include aggression and pro-social, helping, behavior, mating preferences, attachment, wisdom, the timing of puberty, and sleep patterns, among many others. Behavioral genetics, the field of inquiry that most directly explores the intersection between nature and nurture, is called behavioral genetics. Research in this area helps to explain how much variation in a psychological characteristic is due to genetic differences among individuals, which will shape the kinds of interventions and other applications science can offer. To measure the heritability estimate for a given psychological characteristic, researchers frequently use of kinship study, which examines how genetic and environmental similarities between individuals relate to differences in their traits or behaviors. In twin studies, a type of kinship study, the correspondence between the genetic relatedness of twins, specifically both identical and fraternal, and resulting psychological characteristics are examined. Figure 110. Studying twins helps researchers learn about how genetics and environment influence various aspects of psychological development. Kinship studies allow psychologists to take advantage of naturally occurring variations in the genetic similarities among individuals and compare that information with what we know about the degree of similarity or dissimilarity in the same individual's environments. For example, we know that identical twins who grow up together share close to 100% of their genes, but also have a high degree of overlap in their upbringing. Fraternal twins, like any non-identical set of siblings, share approximately 50% of their genes and have considerably more environmental overlap than non-twin typical siblings who may be born years apart and grow up in different stages or versions of the same household. Studies that observe family members in these contexts allow scientists to discern the relative contributions of genes and environment to the development of psychological characteristics. Behaviorist perspectives. For much of psychology's early history as a scientific discipline, the behaviorist perspective dominated thinking about how an individual's characteristics develop and change over time. This perspective, also known as learning theory, focuses on an environment's role in influencing behavior and behavioral changes. When we think of language development, for instance, it is easy to be amazed by the rapid rate of growth in a child's vocabulary size, complexity of sentences, and skill in communication. It may seem that language development happens suddenly and naturally. Upon further examination, however, and with using the learning theories that make up the behaviorist perspective, we can see a tremendous amount of environmental influence working to build and shape the child's acquisition of language. Foundational research into these areas include the development of theories about classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and observational learning. Classical conditioning. Early in psychology's history as a science, Russian physiologist Ivan Pavlov accidentally uncovered the principles that came to be known as classical conditioning. While studying the digestive system of dogs, Pavlov noticed that his experimental subjects, dogs, would often salivate even when he hadn't produced the meat powder which was meant to trigger their salivation. The dogs had come to associate the sound of a bell, which signaled the start of each experimental trial, with impending food, and thus they would salivate when they heard the bell, even without the meat powder. Pavlov became curious about this and soon discovered the principles of classical conditioning. In classical conditioning, a neutral or meaningless stimulus, in the case of Pavlov's dogs, the sound of the bell, takes on the same meaning for the learner as the natural stimulus with which it is accidentally or intentionally paired, in this case, the meat powder. As a result, the previously neutral stimulus then produces the same behavioral outcomes as the natural stimulus. The natural stimulus, which has inherent meaning like the smell of food, is called an unconditional stimulus, while the once neutral trigger is called a conditioned stimulus, because the learner has become conditioned to respond to it. Figure 1.11. In classical conditioning, food initially triggers salivation, while a bell does not. After repeatedly pairing the bell with food, the bell alone triggers salivation. This type of learning is a form of associative learning, in which the repeated presence of two stimuli resulting in linking them, making their meaning synonymous. A language learner's vocabulary can be built this way. For example, a toddler is presented with an apple, and at the same time the word apple. It doesn't take many repetitions before the child associates the object apple with the word label apple. Operant conditioning. B.F. Skinner uncovered the fundamental principles of learning theory in the early 20th century. Skinner's studies built on Thorndike's law of effect, the philosophical idea that the consequences of an action tend to alter the frequency of the action. From this came the understanding of operant conditioning, the theory of learning that outlines how feedback from the environment shapes an individual's behavior. Essentially, Skinner's theory explains how behaviors are strengthened or weakened according to their consequences. According to Skinner's operant conditioning theory, learning starts with an individual performing a behavior. The environment can then provide encouraging feedback called reinforcement, discouraging feedback in the form of punishment, or a neutral response, including ignoring the behavior. Given positive or negative feedback, the individual learns that the value of the behavior and typically modifies its frequency. The practice of shaping gradually builds complex behaviors by rewarding actions that get closer and closer to the desired outcome. For example, in the case of language development, when a caregiver holds up an apple and a toddler says, "Appa," the caregiver may exclaim excitedly, "Yes, an apple." The next week, though, the caregiver might respond with less enthusiasm and instead repeat, "Apple, apple." Only when the child responds with the more accurate apple would the caregiver give the same enthusiastic praise as before. In this way, speech can be built and shaped over time. Notice the role of rich and varied environmental feedback in producing this type of learning. Albert Bandura studied the principles of observational learning that explains how learning can occur through the social act of observing others who are themselves learning. Among Bandura's contributions are two noteworthy insights to our understanding of human development and learning. First, His work recognized that humans are social animals. We live, learn, and develop within the presence of others, and we are influenced by and influence one another. Second, he demonstrated that the processes of classical conditioning and operant conditioning can guide learning. When we observe others' actions and the consequences of those actions, we learn too. This indirect or vicarious learning through others is common in today's media saturated environment, where we are exposed to the actions and learnings of others through our computer screens, smartphones, and televisions. Figure 1.12. Long running educational television shows like Sesame Street and Dora the Explorer provide abundant opportunities for a child viewer to learn language, for instance, by observing others' language learning. Figure 1.12. Learning by viewing others can be powerful. A. Yoga students learn by observation as their instructor demonstrates the correct stance and movement for students' live model. B. Models do not have to be physically present for learning to occur, however. Through symbolic modeling, this child can learn a behavior by watching someone demonstrate it on video. The theories and principles that together make up the behaviorist perspective offer a powerful set of explanations for the development of complex behaviors, capabilities, and characteristics, such as language and personality, especially in response to environmental feedback. Developmental assets approach. In thinking about lifespan development, what specific developmental outcomes should we seek to foster in the developing individual? The theories of Piaget and Erikson, for example, identify the highest levels of development in cognition and personality as desirable achievements along life's journey, especially by the time adulthood is reached. A group of developmental psychologists at the Search Institute have surveyed the large body of developmental findings and outlined 40 qualities that should be nurtured during youth. These qualities are called developmental assets. 20 of these developmental assets are internal to the person, such as psychological qualities like self-esteem and a sense of purpose. The other 20 assets are external, resources like a caring educational environment and positive family communication, that are found in particular social connections in the broader community. A sample listing of these assets is found in Table 1.3. Type of asset, external. Asset category, support. Description, strong support and effective communication from family, school, and other adults in the community. Type of asset, external. Asset category, empowerment. Description, adults in the community value youth engagement and strive to provide safe environments. Type of asset, external. Boundaries and expectations. Description, clear and consistent structures in family, school, and community that encourage youth toward high expectations and model positive, responsible behavior. Type of asset, external. Asset category, constructive use of time. Description, participation in a balance of activities such as youth and community programs, creative arts, sports, and religious practices. Type of asset, internal. Asset category, commitment to learning. Description, motivation to be engaged in learning, fulfill academic responsibilities, and do their best in schooling. Type of asset, internal. Asset category, positive values. Description, practicing behaviors based on caring, equality, integrity, honesty, and responsibility. Type of asset, internal. Asset category, social competencies. Description, development of social skills and personal abilities aimed toward healthy choices, tolerance, understanding, and positive relationships with others. Type of asset, internal. Asset category, positive identity. Description, sense of positive self-esteem, empowerment, and optimistic outlook over one's future. These assets provide an inventory of developmental goals whose achievement can be assessed at various points in life. But they also serve as a set of value statements for those concerned with developing healthy and well-functioning individuals in our society. Research validating the assets has shown the benefits of this inventory approach. A large-scale survey of more than 100,000 youth in the United States revealed that individuals in grades 6 through 12 possessed on average 20 of the assets. The most common, held by more than 70% of the survey respondents, were integrity, achievement, motivation, family support, positive peer influence, and a favorable view of their future. The least common, attained by 25% or fewer, were living in a community that values youth, reading for pleasure, and having creative activities to pursue. Developing and possessing these assets makes a difference. The more assets an individual has acquired, the more likely they are to succeed in school, help others, value diversity, resist danger, and overcome adversity. In short, the more assets one possesses, the more likely the individual is to thrive. Individuals with fewer assets are more likely to engage in risky behaviors, including drug and alcohol misuse and school truancy. Surveys like this allow us to measure our performance as a community in supporting the development of healthy and well-adjusted individuals. 1.4. Context and settings of development. Learning objectives. By the end of this section, you will be able to explain the meaning of a contextual perspective on development, identify the various contextual settings of the ecological systems model, identify sources of influences that lead to individual differences and similarities across the lifespan, describe and give examples of cohort, identity, social, and cultural contexts. Chloe is a public health official working for the local government. They have been preparing a new program that will provide 1 year of comprehensive nutritional analysis and dietary recommendations for hundreds of older adults in the region. Participants will also receive 5 healthy meals per week delivered to them. Chloe has a relatively large grant to pay for this program and all of its benefits, and they want it to help as many people as possible. They wonder how best to increase awareness and participation. They also worry that after the program ends in a year, participants won't be able to continue with the recommended nutritional guidelines. Chloe knows they can't make the program a success all on their own. Support will be needed from partners in the community, ranging from government and nonprofit agencies to faith-based organizations, local media, and volunteers who work in area businesses. The program's success depends on Chloe's ability to take full advantage of the social system the older adults live within. Chloe's task isn't just about creating a good program, but also about understanding the complex social world of older adults. To really help, Chloe needs to see how different parts of these older adults' lives, like family, friends, and community services, all work together. In considering the many theoretical perspectives in psychology, one stands out as closest to providing an overall framework for understanding the full complexity of human development within larger contexts like these. Yuri Bronfenbrenner ecological systems model is based on mapping out the interactions between developing individuals and various environmental influences. Developed in the late 1970s, this work was based on insights Bronfenbrenner had gained in the previous decade as a co-founder of the U.S. Head Start program, a groundbreaking interdisciplinary approach to aiding children through education-focused childcare, nutrition services, and parenting classes for caregivers. That federal program, which still assists millions of children today, contained many of the basic elements of Bronfenbrenner's proposed focus on the social ecology of human development. Ecological systems model. As you're aware, human development is complex. Bronfenbrenner's original ecological systems model helps to rein in the complexity by providing a framework for understanding the various sources of influence on an individual's development. This map of the social and physical context for development can integrate the major contextual influences the field of lifespan psychology focuses on in one model or diagram. It helps account for and make sense of varied sources of development and points the way toward context specific avenues for enacting change in a developing person's life. For example, if we want to ensure every young person has a sense of purpose, the ecological systems model shows a variety of contexts where we can begin to build programming and other types of interactions to develop that sense. In this case, their purpose could include a series of curricular interventions at school, followed by community events at the county's recreation center, a media campaign on local television, and outreach to pediatricians' offices. In this way, the social ecological perspective proves its worth by serving developmental psychology's research and application goals. The ecological systems model comprises several interrelated systems nested inside one another, with the individual and their psychological and physical attributes at the core. Figure 1.13. Each system is made of various groupings of environmental influences called contexts. As we move from the individual level toward the outer system, influences on development become more removed from the individual and less direct. Proximal influences are those closest to the individual and that have the most direct influence. Figure 1.13. Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems model provides a framework for exploring the various contexts that influence human development across the lifespan, from the individual to their direct experiences, microsystem, to the more indirect influences, mesosystem and exosystem, to the broader culture, macrosystem, and across the passage of time and historical events. The individual at the core of the ecological systems model includes all past and current psychological and physical functioning, including genetic influences. The developing person is active in this model by participating in and interacting within and among the variety of social contexts represented in each surrounding circle, such as school, peer group, healthcare system, home environment, media, and community. Traditionally, much research in developmental psychology has focused on understanding how development occurs within these different contexts. For example, an entire subfield of psychology called educational psychology has the purpose of uncovering the psychological principles and schooling practices that foster academic achievement and personal development. What Bronfenbrenner's model does is help us see that a child interacts sometimes daily, sometimes on longer time frames, within many such social contexts. These different and distinct contexts or environmental settings, schools, family, peers, healthcare, faith community, and so on, together form the microsystem. If a developing individual directly experiences something, that is a part of their microsystem. Parents, siblings, peers, teachers, extended family members, adult mentors, and healthcare professionals are all actors within a child's microsystem. The mesosystem in Bronfenbrenner's model consists of interactions between the microsystems. These mesosystem contexts don't directly involve the developing individual. An example is a parent-teacher communication, such as a parent-teacher only conference. When elements from separate microsystem contexts, such as school and home, interact with one another, the individual is affected, though indirectly. The child will not be at the conference, but will certainly become aware of any follow-up a parent or teacher may put in place. When a concerned neighbor calls a young adult's parents about their driving habits, This is another example of the mesosystem in action. And in some U.S. states, the Driver's License Bureau can share data with the local board of elections in order to register drivers to vote. Another example of two different settings communicating for the benefit of the individual. The next level of outward, the exosystem, is also made up of social and physical settings or contexts that affect the developing individual indirectly, but they are even further removed from the person's immediate experience or even knowledge. For example, a new workplace policy granting the ability to work from home twice weekly changes the way a caregiver can balance work and home life, likely making it easier to schedule doctor's appointments, run errands, and attend school functions. The developing child in this example may never visit the caregiver's workplace and might not be told about the new policy, but they certainly experience the indirect impacts all the same. Exosystem contexts often include a caregiver's workplace, the broader neighborhood or town, local political constituencies, the school board, extended family, and mass media. At the furthest circle of the influence is the macrosystem, which includes more abstract principles and ideas. This is where the beliefs and ideologies of culture reside. Broad, far reaching influences like general social conditions and forces, national politics and laws, economic systems, cultural values, and/or religious ideology and/or cultural values help to shape the underlying structure of the entire social ecosystem. A change in one of these elements means large scale, far reaching, but very indirect changes to many other contexts in the ecosystem, in the exosystem, mesosystem, and microsystem. One final level of the social ecological model is what Brofenbrenner calls the chronosystem. This element was his way of noting that all the contexts and all the interactions at all levels are moving together through historical time. Even if we could take a snapshot of an individual and map out all the sources of influence in great detail, the chronosystem reminds us that all those parts and that detailed understanding are subject to change over time. The COVID-19 pandemic is an example of both a macrosystem and a chronosystem change as a historical event that forced the rethinking and reordering of nearly every function in every context in people's lives. The COVID-19 pandemic also impacted the life periods of each individual based on their life stages. For example, the stage of life a person was in when the pandemic began resulted in different experiences for the individual, from specific years of school at home to a shift to work from home, or even to move up a retirement date to avoid individual health risks. To understand how the ecological system model applies to the individual at its center, consider the example case of Elise, who lives in the Midwestern United States state of Minnesota. Elise is 6 years old, healthy, feisty, and gender identifies as female, the individual. Her microsystem is her family, home environment, 2 neighborhood friends, her school and teachers, her pediatrician, and extracurriculars, art and t-ball. Elise's mesosystem consists of the interaction and connection between the microsystem and other systems. For example, her father volunteers at her school and regularly talks to her teachers. Her exosystem is the government in the state and country, the political systems around her, the lawmakers of Minnesota, mass media, children's television and movies, and the county school district and school board, as well as her parents, colleagues, and work interactions. For example, when her mother has a stressful day at work, she comes home a bit grumpier and is less fun to play with. She doesn't interact with her mother's work personally, but it still influences her and the environments around her. Elise's macrosystem is the United States culture and values of the current time. For example, a value for consumerism and gender roles will influence her and the things around her. Even in her family, she is encouraged to be free to be herself and androgynous, or to value the reduce, reuse, recycle concept. Finally, Elise's chronosystem is how these elements develop and change over time. For example, global concerns over environmental resources may result in shifts in the culture as more people take on values of sustainability. There are a few ways developmental psychologists might describe the role of various environmental contexts and systems. For example, Bronfenbrenner later updated the ecological systems model to improve on the original model. The updated model is often referred to as the bioecological model, an expansion of the ecological systems model that includes the representation of the active individual human at the center of the model and engagement and growth across all contextual layers. Another influential system theory is dynamic systems, which focuses on the interaction between aspects of the child, such as their cognition and physical motor skills, and their environment, such as their play space or home. The unifying theme of these system models is that humans are growing and changing in a rich set of contextual environments, such as the environment's influence the individual. The individual also influences the environment. Context of growth and change. In the study of psychology across the lifespan, microsystem contexts help to place development within major influential settings. In many cases, a context becomes a source of its own unique set of influences. Schooling, for example, is a major portion of most children's day and presents its own forces and situations that shape an individual's development. You'll learn about these contexts like schools, parents, peers, media, legal settings, and healthcare settings, were especially relevant to understanding unique sources and mechanisms of influence on development, and to identify specific opportunities and challenges facing those who wish to apply developmental science within these settings. Some of the questions and issues you'll explore in this course include the following. What is the best way to structure the school day in terms of start times? Should students be grouped by similar ability level or across levels? At what age is an individual ready to participate in medical decision making? Are there ways to prevent bullying behavior? How much screen time is unhealthy for development? What laws and policies can best support work-life balance? How can we support successful retirement planning? Historical and cohort contexts. Ahmed was born in 1978 and is a member of Generation X, the name often given to the group of individuals born approximately between 1965 and 1980. Members of this age cohort, you may have heard this term, grew up without computers in their home, but likely were exposed to computers in their K-12 or college education. The internet emerged in the mid-1990s when this group entered young adulthood. Social media became available as this age cohort approached middle adulthood. The chronosystem is the basis for the notion of a cohort effect, the influence of a shared or common experience on people who are about the same age at the same time, figure 1.14. Like the members of other cohorts, Generation Xers likely share the experience of many historical events, cultural milestones, and technological innovations, such as the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the cultural explosion of music videos. Most importantly, they were in roughly the same age range during these experiences, making them members of a generational cohort who share similar psychological consequences of these events. For example, Gen Xers have been referred to as digital immigrants, whereas individuals born after 1980, the age cohort sometimes called millennial, are considered digital natives. People in these different generational cohorts tend to have different comfort levels with new uses for digital technology. One study found that individuals in the older cohort were willing to adopt tap payment systems in stores and restaurants, but weighed the risks and convenience factors more carefully than those born more recently. Figure 1.14. People belonging to a generational cohort shared the experience of historical events and social changes at a similar age. For example, individuals who experience A, the Great Depression, B, the 9/11 terrorist attacks, or C, virtual schooling due to the COVID-19 pandemic will share some aspects of development with others who experience those at the same life stages. Thus, age, history, and society combine to provide groups of individuals with shared experiences that may affect a variety of issues related to psychological functioning across the lifespan, such as having shared anxiety about the threat of nuclear war, Gen X, or being more open to sharing many aspects of their lives with strangers on the internet. Age cohorts raised during the rise of smartphones and social media. However, it is important to remember that not all group members share all of these experiences, and age cohorts are often 12 to 15 years in range, making for a varied degree of impact of cohort effects. For example, some from the Generation Z cohort born after 1996 who were born in 1997 likely have different experiences with smartphones and the age at which they got their first smartphone compared to Gen Z members born in 2007, around the same time that smartphones were becoming widely available to many. Nevertheless, cohort effects as part of Bronfenbrenner's chronosystem remind us that the world is ever changing. It is also important to keep in mind that the term cohort often more accurately describes a group's shared experiences than the term generation, which can sometimes result in stereotyping a group according to their age. Individual differences in things like cultural experiences, economic resources, and where you live can mean that two individuals who share the same year of birth have very different experiences. For example, a child growing up in a family with more financial resources and or parents who value staying connected may receive a smartphone while they are in elementary school, while a child growing up in a family with fewer financial resources and or parents who pay close attention to tech time might not have their first smartphone until they're in their mid to late teens. At the very least, psychological research needs to be mindful of the potential impact of such effects and periodically revisit research findings and theories to test for any influence of such cohort-based experiences. Identity, social, and cultural context. Research findings in psychology are often broken down by social or cultural subgroups of particular interest or identification. These include biological sex, gender, race, and ethnicity, religious beliefs, socioeconomic status, and cultural influences, among others. When developmental psychologists use these terms, they do so with the specific meanings they carry in psychology. These contexts are all important to the overall process of human development. Sex, gender, and sexual orientation are key components of human development and are distinctive terms based on their biological anatomy and physiology, such as chromosomes. People may be assigned female, male, or intersex. An individual's sex should not be confused with their gender, which describes society's ideas about the roles, attitudes, and behaviors associated with someone's sex assignment. For example, being born without a penis results in being assigned the sex male. Exhibiting behaviors such as participating in rough sports or suppressing emotions resulting in being associated with the gender male in cultures where those behaviors are associated with masculinity. Researchers and advocates aim to separate descriptors of sex, female and male, from those of gender, girl, boy, woman, man, non-binary, and so on. While it is best to be as precise as possible, this practice is not universal and may be complicated when both sex and gender are involved in a topic or outcome. As a result, many studies or documents use sex and gender terms interchangeably. The way a culture decides whether a characteristic or behavior is associated with a gender can also change over time. For example, in the United States, the color blue is often associated with baby boys. However, if you look to popular trends before 1940s, pink was associated with boys and blue was associated with girls. Someone's psychological sense of their gender is their gender identity and reflects ideas about femininity, masculinity, non binary characteristics, and other dimensions of gender. How someone labels their gender identity is also related to whether their gender matches society's expectations based on sex assignment. Conforming is denoted by the prefix cis, such as a cisgender man, and nonconforming by the prefix trans, such as transgender individual. A person's sexual orientation, sexual identity, sexual behavior, and sexual attraction are to whom someone is sexually attracted. Note that sexual attraction can differ from emotional attraction. Figure 1.15 visualizes some of these terms and their varied meanings. Figure 1.15, the gender unicorn, is a visual concept developed by Trans Student Educational Resources. This flying version from Florida International University was created to promote education and discussion about the many facets of gender. Race and ethnicity are also often confused, but they are distinct contributing parts of an individual's identity. The concept of race is extremely complex and has a long and troubling history, and there is no genetic base for race, meaning an individual's race cannot be determined by analyzing their DNA. Race is thus a socially constructed concept that describes a highly variable mix of physical characteristics, heritage, culture of origin, and the way someone identifies themselves and how others identify them. Someone's ethnicity is described shared characteristics or identification based on cultural or social elements such as heritage, religion, language, or geographic or national origin, and includes ideas about race. Often the two concepts are conflated. For example, one study might focus on Black individuals, a racial designation, and another on African American participants, a designation of ethnicity. It is important to be aware of racial and ethnic categorizations when reviewing research. Ethnicity is often best described as accurately as possible and in a way that respects how that group or person identifies. For example, using the term Japanese American, a designation of ethnicity describing individuals living in the United States with Japanese culture or heritage, might more precisely describe a group than the term Asian American, a designation of ethnicity that includes the cultural heritage of a wide range of Asian countries or Asian ethnicities. In most cases, the psychological processes of interest in any comparison are more closely related to the cultural and/or national heritage of the participants than to race. The reason is that heritage includes many behaviors, attitudes, and practices that are the likely mechanism of influence for any psychological findings. For this reason, we also use the term ethno-racial for findings that focus on ethnicity as the primary variable, but also acknowledge the social construction of race. Generally speaking, socioeconomic status, SES, is a description of someone's social standing. It has three main components: income level, educational attainment, the highest level of formal schooling reached, and occupational prestige. As an example, for many mid-career cardiologists, income level is moderate to high, educational attainment is the highest, and occupational prestige is high, resulting in a middle to upper middle SES position in society. In contrast, a college professor raising two kids on one income may be described as having a low to moderate income with educational attainment at the highest and a moderate to high occupational prestige. For identifying the SES of children and adolescents, researchers use parental information about the three elements. An individual's religious or spiritual beliefs and practices and those that surround them also play an important role in development across the lifespan. A religion is a formal system of beliefs, values, and practices organized around the worship of a higher being or power. According to a 2022 Gallup poll, two-thirds of the world's population belong to a religion. The term religiosity refers to specifically religious behaviors such as praying, giving money to a place of worship or religious organization, and being active within a religious community. It is possible to identify as belonging to a religion, but to be low in religiosity. The term spirituality refers to an individual's search for the sacred. This search can vary across the spectrum, from belonging to an organized religion to being very personal and private. Almost a quarter of U.S. adults, 22%, consider themselves spiritual but not religious. One way to think about the relationship among these three concepts is that religion is part of your social identity. Religiosity describes your behaviors within that social group, and spirituality is what you experience on a psychological level. The term culture is often used interchangeably with nation or society, but it is broader than either and often refers to the shared characteristics of populations that cross national boundaries. Sometimes a culture might also overlap with a religious group. For example, a person may describe themselves as part of the Jewish culture and may or may not also identify with Judaism as religion. It's important to note that in many instances, these terms may overlap each other. Others may be drawn toward both valuing the different aspects of cultural and or religious Judaism. So these terms are often not clearly distinct from one another. Culture also include informal institutions, rules, and practices. Veganism, for example, is a culture. Similarly, the college you attend likely has its own college culture. A society, in contrast, is a recognized group of people who live within a formal system of rules and institutions like a government and school systems. The Navajo Nation is an example of a society, though many members may identify themselves as part of the Dene culture. In a review analyzing the many uses of the word culture, Cohen in 2009 outlined three main concepts of its psychological definition. Culture includes a set of adaptations to the physical and social world, a set of practices, behaviors, rules, norms, and ways of being that help members of that culture navigate the challenges and opportunities of life. These adaptations have meaning shared by members of the culture. These shared adaptations are passed from generation to generation, thereby ensuring the culture persists over time. A culture can have many members or just a few if these three elements are present. Each of us is likely a member of many different cultures, some more important or central to our sense of self than others. For example, you may be part of Southern California culture, American culture broadly, Mexican American culture, and Generation Z culture simultaneously. These overlapping cultural groups contribute to your unique identity. Lifespan development psychology is a broad discipline. It often incorporates perspectives and research findings from across a variety of disciplines, including anthropology, neuroscience, biology, sociology, economics, and history. As the world gets smaller and more interconnected via travel, migration, trade, and communication technologies, the biggest challenge the discipline faces is assessing the generalizability of its findings. In short, to what extent do the theories, research methods, and findings apply universally? That is, to all people in all societies around the world. In the last decade, psychology has been challenged to address the universality of its findings. A landmark article by Henrik 2010 highlighted that much of the research on which psychology is based is WEIRD. The acronym describes the people researchers have often studied. Western, including the United States, Canada, and Western Europe countries such as France and Germany. Educated, including those who have gone to college. Industrialized includes countries with infrastructure and advanced technology. Rich, including those who have enough money to have a higher standard of living. And democratic, including political systems based on elected representation and individual rights. Why might this be so? Recall that psychology at its founding emphasized the study of individuals, which meant that some societies, through their emphasis on individuality, were more receptive to this new discipline than others. As such, psychology's roots in many European countries, especially Germany, Great Britain, and France, and the quick pace in which the discipline took hold in the United States and Canada inadvertently introduced this weird bias. Findings from this restrictive weird sample have long been assumed to generalize to people from most societies. But today we must ask, how truly representative of all humans are these findings? In research, we often strive for a representative sample, which is a sample of participants that accurately reflects or represents the group of people we are making conclusions about. A more representative sample allows us to better generalize our findings to the population. Although the establishment of psychology's scientific roots occurred first in Europe and the United States, it did not take much time until the researchers from around the world began to establish their own laboratories and research programs. For example, some of the first experimental psychology laboratories in South America were founded by Horacio Pinheiro in 1869 from 1919 at two institutions in Buenos Aires, Argentina. In India, Gunamundian David Boaz from 1908 to 1965, and Narendra Nath Sen Gupta from 1889 to 1944 established the first independent departments of psychology at the University of Madras and the University of Calcutta, respectively. These developments provided an opportunity for Indian researchers to make important contributions to the field. In searching the psychological literature, Draper and colleagues in 2023 found rare instances when a topic had been studied across multiple cultures. Nevertheless, a growing amount of research in a variety of psychological topics is now aimed at determining whether the discipline's findings are universal or whether we should expect cultural variations to be the norm. These topics include personality structure, visual perception, attachment and human bonding, conceptions of the self, degree of interconnectedness, conformity, and reasoning style. Consider the example of school children learning fractions. Recall that in Vygotsky's socio-cultural theory of cognitive development, language can be a tool that guides cognition and cognitive development. Cross-cultural research has highlighted a language-based explanation for why Korean children may have an easier time learning fractions than their U.S. counterparts. The Korean language is more straightforward when describing fractions. 1/2 is expressed as one of two parts instead of 1/2, as in English. The more transparent expressions may help Korean children master the concept more readily. Learning complex mathematical concepts is universal, but the rate and level of achievement might vary due to cultural differences. The lack of representation in historic research and modern insights into generalizability provide the discipline of lifespan development with a call to expand thinking and research to include people from more walks of life and from across the globe. The psychological sciences have already made large advances in including more representation in those who do the research or the experts in the field of psychology and lifespan development. For example, in terms of gender inclusion, the American Psychological Association began in 1892 with all men members, but by 1946, nearly 1/4 of American psychologists were women. Women and minorities in psychology, no date. Making progress in representation of the experts in the field of study as well as the populations studied can advance our understanding of human development at every contextual level, from individual differences to cultural commonalities. An example is the Many Babies Project, which is a global collaboration of developmental researchers that have shown how similar babies across cultures are when it comes to things like their preferences for certain speech styles, known as infant direct speech. Sometimes the research shows us that the early findings, exclusive to weird populations, are also found in newer research on non weird populations. For a science that looks to both nature and nurture for sources of influence on development, we are likely to find patterns of similarity in psychological functioning across all humans, even as we find specific behaviors that have their own nuanced and even unique developmental trajectory around the world. 1.5 Lifespan Development as a Science, Research Methods, Learning Objectives. By the end of this section, you'll be able to identify the major research methods for studying individuals across the lifespan, describe the strengths and weaknesses of different research methods, compare and contrast correlation and causation, discuss ethical considerations in lifespan development research. Ryan works for the federal government and was recently put in charge of selecting an anti-bullying program to recommend to all school districts in the country. Many programs have been created and tested in different settings over the past few years. They vary on the age range of the children they were tested on, the time each takes to deliver, the number of sessions, whether the participant's behavior was tracked across time, and whether a teacher, a principal, or a safety officer delivered the program. Luckily, Ryan has training in social science research methods and was able to think through relevant issues to help make the determination. For example, it was important to consider which programs show a cause and effect relationship between program delivery and a decrease in school bullying, and also whether any unique aspects of the settings in which each program was tested might disqualify them for nationwide implementation. Ryan's job shows how important research skills are in the scholarship and application of issues across the discipline of developmental psychology. This way of thinking is like what psychological scientists do. They look at evidence carefully, think about issues that could affect the results, and focus on studies that show a clear connection between cause and effect. Ryan is using this scientific way of thinking to deal with a real-world problem. While behavior is observable, the mind is not. If someone is crying, we can see behavior. However, the reason for the behavior is more difficult to determine. Is the person crying due to being sad, in pain, or because they are happy? Sometimes we can learn the reason for someone's behavior by simply asking a question like, "Why are you crying?" However, there are situations in which an individual is either uncomfortable or unwilling to answer the question honestly or is incapable of answering. For example, infants would not be able to explain why they are crying. In such circumstances, the developmental psychologist must be creative in finding ways to better understand behavior. An important foundation of the study of lifespan development is understanding how scientific knowledge is generated and how important that knowledge is in forming decisions in our personal lives. While many of us feel confident in our abilities to decipher and interact with the world around us, history is filled with examples of how very wrong we can be when we fail to recognize the need for evidence in supporting claims. It is through systematic scientific research that we were able to disengage ourselves of our preconceived notions and superstitions and gain an objective understanding of ourselves and our world. The goal of all scientists is to better understand the world around them. Developmental psychologists focus their attention on understanding behavior as well as the cognitive, mental, and physiological bodily processes that underlie behavior. In contrast to other methods that people use to understand the behavior of others, such as intuition and personal experience, the hallmark of scientific research is that there is evidence to support a claim. Scientific knowledge is empirical. It is grounded in objective, tangible evidence that can be observed and replicated. The process of scientific research. Scientific knowledge is advanced through the scientific method, in which ideas in the form of theories and hypotheses are tested against the real world in the form of empirical observations. Those empirical observations lead to more ideas that are tested against the real world, and so on. In this sense, the scientific process is a cycle of deductive and inductive reasoning. Researchers test ideas. In deductive reasoning, ideas are tested in the real world, whereas in inductive reasoning, real world observations lead to new ideas. These processes are inseparable, like inhaling and exhaling, but different research approaches place different emphasis on these aspects. For example, case studies are heavily weighted on the side of empirical observations. Thus, case studies are closely associated with inductive processes as researchers gather massive amounts of observations and seek interesting patterns, new ideas, in the data. Experimental research, on the other hand, puts great emphasis on deductive reasoning. If both theories and hypotheses are ideas, what sort of ideas are they exactly? A theory is a well-developed set of ideas that propose an explanation for observed phenomena. Theories are repeatedly checked against the world, but they tend to be too complex to be tested all at once. Instead, researchers create hypotheses that test specific aspects of a theory. For example, many of the theories discussed thus far have been tested by many research studies over multiple decades, resulting in a more current version of the theory. This is demonstrated in things like our updated understanding of language development and the role of the environment in learning language. A hypothesis is a testable prediction about how the world will behave if our idea is correct, and it is often worded as an if-then statement. For example, if I study all night, I will get a passing grade on the test. The hypothesis is extremely important because it bridges the gap between the realm of ideas and the real world. As specific hypotheses are tested, theories are modified and refined to reflect and incorporate the result of these tests. Note that theories are not typically proven, rather they are supported, modified, or rejected. Psychological research and developmental psychology. Developmental psychology, as part of the broader scientific community, has several overarching goals. Those goals can be organized to match the way a developmental scientist may approach any new topic of inquiry. The first goal is accurate measurement and description of the phenomenon in question. With proper research methods and techniques, come detailed descriptions of the research question. In the case of cognitive development, for example, Piaget pioneered the clinical interview method to uncover children's underlying thought processes. This led to rich descriptions of the reasoning abilities of children of various ages. To summarize this first goal, it seeks to answer the question, what is happening? The next goal of science is to understand and explain a phenomenon. It is not enough to merely describe what is observed. Rather, we want to understand the processes that make that phenomenon work and to explain it to others in a coherent and complete way. Piaget developed and then tested a complete theory of how children solve problems around the world. The result is his theory of cognitive development, which attempts to explain how children's thinking abilities develop over the first 20 years of life. To summarize this second goal, we now ask, why is this thing happening? The final goal of developmental psychology science, which relies on our understanding from achieving the second goal, is to apply and control the phenomenon. That is, developmental scientists aim to take their findings and explanations and apply them in the service of the individual or society. In this way, the goal of the scientific method mirror what humans have done as a matter of survival for millennia: adapt to and strive to thrive in the physical and social world, thereby assisting in our shared survival and enjoyment of life. To summarize this final goal, we are asking if/how this thing is going to happen again, how can we or should we control it? Reliability and validity. Whether you are on a path to become a health care professional, educator, or a psychologist, or just have an interest in human development across the lifespan, scientific literacy is a valuable life skill. Being able to discern the credibility of various studies or statistics is important. Understanding statistics and scientific findings such as percentages can help you determine which research results are worth applying. For example, if a medical doctor gives you two options for a medicine, it would be helpful to know which one is most effective and whether its benefits outweigh the potential costs. Because much research in developmental psychology requires studies across longer time spans, it is helpful to know how to trust in the findings of a study and differentiate trustable research from bogus science. Being able to determine bogus science can also help you make effective choices for your health and well-being rather than risk wasted money or time on something that does not work. For research to be trusted, it needs to be proven to be both reliable and valid. The ability to consistently produce a given result is referred to as. In the context of psychological research, this would mean that any instruments or tools used to collect data do so in consistent, reproducible ways. Unfortunately, being consistent in measurement does not necessarily mean that you have measured something correctly. To illustrate this concept, consider a kitchen scale that would be used to measure the weight of cereal that you eat in the morning. If the scale is not properly calibrated, it may consistently under or overestimate the amount of cereal that's being measured. While the scale is highly reliable in producing consistent results, for example, the same amount of cereal poured onto the scale produces the same reading each time. Those results are incorrect because the tool's calibration is off. This is where validity comes into play. Validity refers to the extent to which a given instrument or tool accurately measures what it's supposed to measure. For example, a driving test to determine if someone is ready to have a driver's license is likely to be more valid if it ensures the person knows the rules of driving, written portion, and can also drive a vehicle effectively, applied portion. If we only use one of those, getting a driver's license might not be accurately indicate that a person can drive safely. Researchers strive to design studies and use instruments that are both highly reliable and valid. The temptation to make erroneous cause and effect statements based on correlational research is a common way people tend to misinterpret data. We also tend to make the mistake of illusory correlations, especially with unsystematic observations. Illusory correlations or false correlations occur when people believe that relationships exist between two things when no such relationship exists. One well-known illusory correlation is the supposed effect that the moon's phases have on human behavior. Many people passionately assert that human behavior is affected by the phase of the moon, and specifically that people act strangely when the moon is full. There is no denying that the moon exerts a powerful influence on our planet. The ebb and flow of the ocean's tides are tightly tied to gravitational forces of the moon. Many people believe, therefore, that it is logical that we are affected by the moon as well. A meta-analysis of nearly 40 studies consistently demonstrated, however, that a relationship between the moon and our behavior does not exist. While we may pay more attention to odd behavior during the full phase of the moon, the rates of odd behavior remain constant throughout the lunar cycle. Why are we apt to believe in illusory correlations like this? Often we read or hear about them and simply accept the information as valid. Or we have a hunch about how something works and then look for evidence to support that hunch, ignoring evidence that would tell us our hunch is false. This is known as confirmation bias. Other times, we find illusory correlations based on the information that comes most easily to mind, even if that information is severely limited. And while we may feel confident that we can use these relationships to better understand and predict the world around us, illusory correlations can have significant drawbacks. For example, research suggests that illusory correlations, in which certain behaviors are inaccurately attributed to certain groups, are involved in the formation of prejudicial attitudes that can ultimately lead to discriminatory behavior. When evaluating findings, it is important to consider the extent to which a study complies with established standards of research integrity, and also to understand that an initial finding may suggest an exciting discovery, but may not prove to be accurate once further research is conducted to replicate the results. For example, the popular idea that there is a connection between vaccines and autism spectrum disorder originated from findings that were falsified and later retracted. While there were seemingly logical connections, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention recommended that mercury be removed from vaccines. Similarities between symptoms of mercury poisoning and symptoms of autism spectrum disorder, the empirical evidence showed that there was no causal connection between those observations. The now debunked study connecting vaccines to autism spectrum disorder remains a popular concept, but is not supported by science. This case highlights the importance of scientists complying with the standards set by regulating bodies. Another example, the so-called Mozart effect, elucidates the importance of replicability. One study may find certain results, but before those are generalizable, researchers in psychology need to demonstrate that the same results occur in other studies. Due to the nature of the time required to study change in a human, sometimes it takes several years or even decades to test whether results are replicable. When Rauscher and colleagues reported that listening to music by Mozart improved how children performed on tests, it spawned a popular trend to integrate that music and concept into children's toys, books, and educational programming. While Rauscher's findings were true to that particular study, subsequent research could not replicate the surprising findings. In further studies, it was determined that there was little to no scientific support for the Mozart effect. In this example, we say that replication is important in psychological research, especially in context of it being applied to everyday life. Research design. Many research methods are available to psychologists in their effort to understand, describe, and explain behavior, change, and growth, plus the cognitive and biological processes that underlie such change. Some methods rely on observational techniques, while other approaches involve interactions between the researcher and the individuals who are being studied. Each research method has unique strengths and weaknesses, and each method may only be appropriate for certain types of research questions. For example, studies that rely primarily on observation produce large amounts of information, but the ability to apply this information to the broader population, representativeness of the sample, is somewhat limited because of small sample sizes. Correlational research can find a relationship between two variables, but the only way a researcher can claim that the relationship between variables is cause and effect is to perform an experiment. In experimental research, there is a tremendous amount of control over variables of interest. While this is a powerful approach, experiments are often conducted in artificial settings. This calls into question the ecological validity of experimental findings with regard to how that would apply in real-world settings. In addition, many of the questions that psychologists would like to answer cannot be pursued through experimental research because of ethical issues. Case studies and naturalistic observation. The field of developmental psychology has a rich history of using descriptive methods to explore change, growth, and stability in individuals over time. In a case study, a great amount of detail is gathered about one or more individuals of interest to gain a thorough understanding of each person. At the end of a case study, we likely have a good sense of an individual's life and developmental history. The downside is that the insight we've gleaned is often applicable only to the study of the case study. In other words, it does not have ecological validity because it does not generalize to people other than those being studied. Still, there are usually takeaway findings that we may be able to generalize to the larger population. In one case study, Oliver Sacks discussed a man who suddenly began having trouble understanding what the familiar objects in his environment were. When he looked at his wife, for example, he gave his best guess that he was looking at a hat rack. After extensive evaluation, Sacks determined that the man had developed visual agnosia. He had the ability to see, but he could not make sense of what he was looking at. If his wife spoke or if he reached out and touched her, he knew instantly that it was her. His problem was only with visual recognition. Through his study and resulting case report, Sacks developed a detailed understanding of the underlying neurological problem, its development, and the likely course of the disease progression. The research method of naturalistic observation is the observation of research participants in real-life settings. If you want to understand how behavior occurs, one of the best ways to gain information is to simply observe the behavior in its natural context. For instance, if we want to study whether older adults benefit from playing video games, we might start by observing older adults in the recreational areas of an assisted living facility. The downside is that in true naturalistic observation, there is no control over the setting, and researchers are unable to interact with those being observed because people might change their behavior in unexpected ways if they know they are being observed. As an example, imagine that your instructor asks everyone in your class if they always wash their hands after using the restroom. Chances are that almost everyone in the classroom will raise their hand, but do you think hand washing every trip to the restroom is really that universal? An example of structured observation, a type of observation where people are observed while engaging in set specific tasks, comes from The Strange Situation, developed by Mary Ainsworth. The strange situation is a procedure used to evaluate attachment styles that exist between an infant and caregiver. In this scenario, caregivers bring their infants into a room filled with toys. The strange situation involves a number of phases, including a stranger coming into the room, the caregiver leaving the room, and the caregiver's return to the room. The infant's behavior is closely monitored at each phase, but it is the behavior of the infant on being reunited with the caregiver that is most telling in terms of characterizing the infant's attachment style with the caregiver. A benefit of naturalistic observation is the validity or accuracy of information collected unobtrusively in a natural setting. Having individuals behave as they normally would in a given situation means there is a higher degree of ecological validity or realism than might be gathered with other research approaches like asking about hand washing instead of observing it. Therefore, the ability to generalize the findings of the research to everyday situations is enhanced. The power of naturalistic observation is to give the researcher ideas about what factors or variables may be relevant to include in a more structured research design later on. The major downside of naturalistic observation is that it is often difficult to set up and control. Another potential problem in observational research is observer bias. Generally, the people who act as observers are closely involved in the research project and may unconsciously skew their observations to fit their research goals or expectations. To protect against this type of bias, researchers should have clear criteria established for the types of behaviors recorded and how those behaviors should be classified. In addition, researchers often compare observations of the same event by multiple observers. In order to test inter-rater reliability, a measure of reliability that assesses the consistency of observations by different observers. Correlation, how variables relate. The next level of research beyond describing a psychological phenomenon is to begin to piece together how variables of your chosen topic might be related. The statistical technique used to determine the degree of relation or association between two or more variables is called correlation. While correlation means there is a relationship between two or more variables, this relationship does not necessarily imply cause and effect. When two variables are correlated, it simply means that as one variable changes, so does the other. We can measure correlation by calculating a statistic known as a correlation coefficient. You might notice that the word correlation includes the word relation, a helpful reminder that it represents variable relations. A correlation coefficient is a number from minus 1.00 to 1.00 that indicates the strength and direction of the relationship between variables. The number portion of the correlation coefficient indicates the strength of the relationship. The closer the number is to 1, be it negative or positive, the more strongly related the variables are, and the more predictable changes in one variable will be as the other variable changes. The closer the number is to 0, the weaker the correlation, and the less predictable the relationship between variables becomes. For instance, a correlation coefficient of 0.9 indicates a far stronger relationship than a correlation coefficient of 0.3. If the variables are not related to one another, the correlation coefficient is 0. The sign, positive or negative, of the correlation coefficient indicates the direction of the relationship. A positive correlation means the variables move in the same direction. Put another way, it means that as one variable increases, so does the other, and conversely, when one variable decreases, so does the other. A negative correlation means that the variables move in opposite directions. If two variables are negatively correlated, a decrease in one variable is associated with an increase in the other, and vice versa. A helpful way to remember positive correlation is to think of two variables riding an elevator. The variables travel together up or down. A negative correlation indicates the variables traveling in opposite directions, such as two friends waving at each other as they pass each other on escalators going in different directions. One goes up, the other goes down. An example of positive correlations is the relationship between an individual's height and weight. Typically, someone who is taller will also weigh more than someone who is much shorter. One might expect a negative correlation to exist between someone's tiredness during the day and the number of hours they slept the previous night. The amount of sleep decreases as the feelings of tiredness increase. In a real-world example of negative correlation, student researchers at the University of Minnesota found a weak negative correlation, R equals minus 0.29, between the average number of days per week that students got fewer than 5 hours of sleep and their GPA. In other words, more sleepless nights was related to a lower GPA. Keep in mind that a negative correlation is not the same as no correlation. For example, we would probably find no correlation between hours of sleep and shoe size. Correlational research is useful because it allows us to discover the strength and direction of relationships that exist between two variables. However, correlation is limited because establishing the existence of a relationship tells us little about cause and effect. While variables are sometimes correlated because one does the other, it could also be that some other factor, a confounding variable, is actually causing the systematic relationship between our variables of interest. Even when we cannot point to clear confounding variables, we should not assume that a correlation between two variables implies that one variable causes change in another. This can be frustrating when a cause and effect relationship seems clear and intuitive. Recall that often dozens of variables or factors are working together to produce even the simplest human behaviors. What this means in practical terms is that you could have two variables moderately correlated with one another, but a third one that's independently influencing the two variables you study. This is called the third variable problem. Take aggressive behavior and violent video game playing, for example. Correlational research shows an association between playing video games and acting out aggressively. However, it's entirely possible that a third variable is related to aggressive outbursts or separately to a preference for playing violent video games. Unfortunately, people mistakenly make claims of causation as a function of correlations all the time. Such claims are especially common in advertisements and news stories. For example, research found that people who eat certain breakfast cereal may have a reduced risk of heart disease. Cereal companies are likely to share this information in a way that maximizes and perhaps overstates the positive aspects of cereal. But does cereal really cause better health, or are there other possible explanations for the health of those who eat cereal? For example, consistent healthy dietary habits or exercise might better explain this association. While correlational research is invaluable in identifying relationships among variables, a major limitation is the inability to establish causality. Psychologists want to make statements about cause and effect, but the only way to do so is to conduct an experiment to answer a research question. The next section describes how scientific experiments incorporate methods that eliminate or control for alternative explanations, which allow researchers to explore how changes in one variable cause changes in another variable. Experiments, cause and effect. The only way to establish a cause and effect relationship between two variables is to conduct a scientific experiment. The experiment has a different meaning in the scientific context than in everyday life. In everyday conversation, we often use it to describe trying something for the first time, such as experimenting with a new hairstyle or trying a new food. However, in the scientific context, an experiment has precise requirements for design and implementation. The experimental method, a research design used to determine cause and effect relationships, including specific design requirements, is a common tool psychological scientists use to investigate development and influences on that development. Some developmental psychologists will study people of a particular age, while others will run experiments across participants who span a variety of ages. The major strength of the experimental method is its ability to determine cause and effect relationships among variables. In one classic experiment, Condrey and Ross tested the idea that knowing the gender of two children behaving aggressively would alter observers' rating of the aggressiveness of the interaction. By altering the gender label attached to video footage of two children engaged in a snowball fight and changing nothing else, the researchers showed that young adult participants rated the boy-boy interaction as least aggressive. The authors concluded that the perception of aggression in children is influenced by observers' different expectations of the behavior of boys and girls. The finding supports the theory of gender schema theory, the notion, which is discussed later, that we form different associations and expectations based on gender categories from an early age. In this example, we have all the primary ingredients of the experimental method. First, the experiment is based on the overarching explanation for a set of observations. The theory generates one or more hypotheses, theory-based predictions that are testable. In our example, the hypothesis was the gender of the observed children would make for different perceptions of aggressiveness. In order to test this hypothesis or prediction, the researchers created different conditions or levels of an independent variable. The variable that is altered in an experiment and is expected to be the cause or influence of some outcome behavior. In fact, the resulting outcome behavior that is measured in an experiment is called the dependent variable. Because values of this variable are determined by or dependent upon the value of the independent variable, in the study by Condrey and Ross, 1985, there were 4 conditions or levels of the independent variable: boy, boy-girl, girl-boy, and girl-girl. Note that the gender label was the only thing the researchers altered. In all 4 conditions, the same video footage was used, and only the gender labels were different. Participants, those watching videos, were randomly assigned to view one of the 4 conditions. A random assignment means each participant has an equal chance of being placed in each condition. In fact, random assignment is an essential aspect of the experimental method. Without it, you may end up with disproportionate number of male participants in one condition and few in another. Random assignment ensures an even distribution of all relevant participant characteristics across all experimental conditions. After observing the assigned video footage, participants in each condition were then asked to rate one of the children along a variety of characteristics, including how aggressively they behave. The researchers then compared the average ratings of aggressiveness across the 4 conditions to see whether the experimental method is the only research method that allows a psychological scientist to conclude that changes in one variable, in this case gender label, cause changes in another, perception of aggression. The reason this conclusion is valid, or an accurate statement of the facts, is that the researchers have carefully manipulated the situation to alter only the variable of interest, and they used random assignment of the raters to neutralize all other relevant factors that could have contributed to the observed outcome. Without random assignment, other variables might explain the observed differences in ratings of the children's aggressiveness. For instance, if the researchers let the first 10 participants who showed up watch the same video segment by happenstance, these might have all been members of the college football team, and that might bias their ratings. Instead, random assignment gave each participant an equal chance to observe each possible label. The ability to pinpoint cause and effect relationships among 2 or more variables come from careful control of the situation. But it does have one potential drawback. Because the experimental scenario is so carefully controlled, the question of artificiality arises. That is, how closely does the experimental scenario match naturally occurring relevant scenarios outside the psychologist's laboratory? This question examines the characteristic called external validity, the degree to which an experiment's results and reality match. Low external validity, on the other hand, is a significant threat to the applicability of laboratory findings to the everyday world. After all, if the experimental setup is so contrived that it doesn't match any situation you might normally encounter, then the value or utility of the finding is in question. What can we do with a research finding that doesn't apply in everyday life? In our example of Condé and Ross, 1985, external validity would appear to be high because the experimental setup used video footage of actual children engaged in a snowball fight. We may not always know the gender of the children involved in every such encounter, but when we do, we can expect that information to inform our judgments. Other drawbacks of the experimental method include the potential cost and time it might take to devise an experiment to test certain topics. In fact, it is not possible, feasible, or sometimes even ethical to test some topics with the experimental method. For example, for both practical and more importantly ethical reasons, a researcher interested in studying the effects of divorce on adolescent development couldn't randomly assign adolescents to different conditions of the independent variable, in this case, whether parents divorce or not. For important topics such as these, psychologists have to wait for conditions to arise through the natural course of life events. This is called a quasi-experimental. Because researchers in a quasi-experiment can't randomly assign participants to the conditions, they lose a considerable amount of control as other variables enter the picture. Perhaps families that experience divorce have a lower household income on average, or perhaps those who do not experience divorce have a higher tendency to belong to a religion that forbids divorce. These and many other variables can make for meaningful ways that the divorce and no divorce conditions vary in a natural or quasi-experiment, making it very difficult to establish a clear cause and effect relationship between divorce itself and adolescent psychological outcomes. However, as noted, a quasi-experiment is the only way to investigate some topics. Developmental psychology has designed some additional research approaches specific to the fundamental question of the field and focus on understanding growth and change in individuals over time. To do this, researchers often employ the cross-sectional or longitudinal method or the cross-sequential design, which combines the advantages of both. All three designs can be used with correlational, experimental, case study, and naturalistic observation methods. Longitudinal study. A longitudinal design studies a group of participants over a period of time, reassessing them at various points. If we are interested in the development of friendships during adolescence, we might recruit a group of 56th grade students. We would give them a personality inventory, collect background information about each, and ask them to complete surveys about their friendships. Then we would find these same 50 participants at 6-month or 1-year intervals, reassessing the same information. At the end of the 5 or 6 years, we'd have a rich data set and a really good idea about the number, type, and quality of friendships change across adolescence. Often longitudinal studies are employed when researching various diseases in an effort to understand particular risk factors. Such studies often involve tens of thousands of individuals who are followed for several decades. Given the enormous number of people involved in these studies, researchers can feel confident that their findings can be generalized to the larger population. The Cancer Prevention Study, CPS-3, is one of a series of longitudinal studies sponsored by the American Cancer Society aimed at determining predictive risk factors associated with cancer. When participants enter the study, they complete a survey about their lives and family histories, providing information on factors that might increase or decrease the risk of developing cancer. Then, every few years, the participants receive additional surveys to complete. In the end, hundreds of thousands of participants will be tracked over 20 years to determine which of them develop cancer and which do not. Clearly, this type of research is important and potentially very informative. For instance, earlier longitudinal studies sponsored by the American Cancer Society provided some of the first scientific demonstrations of the now well-established links between increased rates of smoking and cancer. As with any research strategy, longitudinal research is not without limitations. For one, these studies require an incredible time investment by the researcher and research participants. Given that some longitudinal studies take years, if not decades, to complete, the results will not be known for a considerable period of time. Research participants must also be willing to continue their participation for an extended period of time, and this can be problematic. People move, get ill, and eventually die. Even without significant life changes, some people may simply choose to discontinue their participation in the project. This is known as attrition, the gradual loss or dropping out of participants from the original pool. Another issue is test familiarity, known as practice effects. Since participants are given the same battery of measures, including surveys multiple times, they might get used to the questions, which could alter the way they think about and respond to them. Finally, and this is the most serious challenge in longitudinal research, the longer the study duration, the higher the risk of encountering cohort effects. This means that research results, which in our hypothetical study would take 5 or 6 years to obtain, might end up being limited in their applicability beyond a certain cohort. What if, toward the end of the study, a new virtual reality app was released that changed how teenagers communicate with each other? That would make our findings and the last 6 years of work that went into producing them of limited value and possible obsolete. Nevertheless, a longitudinal design comes closest to observing change within individuals over time, making this a highly valid and valuable approach. Cross-sectional design. A cross-sectional design is a more common developmental research design, and it offers solutions for most of the drawbacks we mentioned with longitudinal studies. A cross-sectional design studies groups of participants of different ages, that is, multiple segments of the population at a given time. In our friendship example, researchers would identify a group of 12-year-olds, 14-year-olds, 16-year-olds, and 18-year-olds, and assess them all on a variety of measures. Thus, they would have results suggesting the developmental progression of friendship type and quality across adolescence in a very short time, possibly a few months as opposed to 6 years. Attrition is not an issue, nor are practice effects, because all the participants are recruited and assessed at just one point in time. One drawback of the cross-sectional approach is its inability to track individual development. Instead, researchers compare different age groups at a single point in time. To understand how development unfolds, researchers must infer the sequence of changes by piecing together data from these different age groups. Finally, with a cross-sectional design, you could still have cohort effects, especially in studies that use a larger range of age groups than in our example. In other words, people who are 10 years old today have likely experienced all sorts of historical and environmental events that shape them as individuals and that are different from the experiences of those who are now 20 and 30 years old. Those different events might be the source of any observed differences among the age groups. Cross-sequential design. A cross-sequential design, sometimes called sequential design, combines the benefits of both cross-sectional and longitudinal designs. As in the cross-sectional design, groups of participants of different ages are recruited. However, instead of being assessed once, these participants are followed for a period of time, although usually much shorter than in a longitudinal study. For example, one child development study measured changes in the brain's executive functioning across middle childhood. To better understand how children's ability to use working memory and inhibition changes across development, the study began with 3 age groups, 5, 7, and 9 years old, and then had all the age groups continue to participate 1 year later. Of course, it's still possible for practice effects to occur, but with care, these can be minimized. Table 1.4 summarizes the effectiveness of different research designs for studying different topics common in developmental psychology. Ethics and psychology research. While many science-based disciplines are able to conduct research with materials or theoretical calculations, such as a chemist in a lab or a physicist planning a space trajectory, developmental psychology mostly relies on humans and other animals as research participants. Given that, special considerations enter into the ethical code of conduct for such research. Today, scientists agree that good research is ethical in nature and is guided by a basic respect for human dignity and safety. Any research institution that receives federal support for research involving human participants must have access to an Institutional Review Board, IRB. The IRB is a committee of individuals often made up of members of the institution's administration, scientists, and community members. The purpose of the IRB is to review proposals for research that involves human participants. The IRB reviews these proposals with the preceding principles mentioned in mind, and generally approval from the IRB is required in order for the experiment to proceed. Research using human subjects. The Society for Research in Child Development provides a code of conduct for developmental research that includes the following principles and protections. Competence. Researchers should be appropriately trained and knowledgeable about their research participants' cultural and social backgrounds and seek to eliminate any personal biases that might influence their research. Participants donate their time, energy, and personal aspects of themselves when they agree to be studied. Researchers show participants respect and gratitude by acting with scientific integrity and interpersonal sensitivity. Informed consent. Obtaining informed consent is a two-part process. Participants need to be fully informed of the purpose of the study, what will be required of them, potential risks, including any harm, and the anticipated benefits to science and themselves from the study. Participants must give permission. Adults can give consent only when they have been fully informed, and children do so only under the guidance of a parent or guardian. Although a child cannot give legal consent, they can give assent and express their desire to participate or not. For example, if a baby is happy and comfortable, a study may continue with assent and consent. However, if a baby is crying and uncomfortable, the research should assume that the child does not consent and end the study. A key part of consent is voluntarism. There should be no coercion, and participants should be free to end their participation in the study at any time. Researchers are ethically bound to ensure the participant knows this and will end the study if requested without coercion. Equity. Research should seek to identify and address developmental inequities and disparities wherever possible. Part of achieving this is being culturally sensitive and informed. Scientific integrity. All of the ethical standards operating in scientific investigation are also relevant and applicable to developmental research. Research findings, methodology, and data should be transparent and shared whenever possible for review by peers. Deception should be minimized, and participants should be debriefed, informed about the pertinent details at the conclusion of the study. Participant information and data should be private. Balance of risk and benefit. Researchers should avoid harm, minimize risk, and weigh any risks against the possible benefits of conducting the research. They should assure participants of the confidentiality of all components of their participation. Dynamic assessment. If researchers uncover an unanticipated harm or other issue during the study, they should alter or discontinue the study. These guidelines help ensure that a degree of integrity is built into scientific research, with extra precautions taken to protect the personal integrity of participants. Developmental science research is difficult, meticulous work undertaken with great care and planning. The results provide benefit as we discover in ever more nuanced detail how humans grow and change and maintain stability over the course of the lifespan. A body of knowledge intended to help us understand one another more fully and better affect positive change in our social world. Ethics and the Tuskegee syphilis study. Unfortunately, the ethical guidelines that exist for research today were not always applied in the past. In 1932, black men in Tuskegee, Alabama, were recruited to participate in an experiment conducted by the U.S. Public Health Service with the aim of studying syphilis in black men. In exchange for free medical care, meals, and burial insurance, 600 men agreed to participate in the study. A little more than half of the men tested positive for syphilis, and they served as the experimental group. Given that the researchers cannot randomly assign participants to the groups, this represents a quasi-experiment. The remaining syphilis-free individuals served as the control group. However, those individuals who tested positive for syphilis were never informed that they had the disease. Figure 1.2. A participant in the Tuskegee syphilis study receives an injection. Why is this unethical? How were the men who participated and their family members harmed as a function of this research? While there was no treatment for syphilis when the study began, by 1947, penicillin was recognized as an effective treatment for the disease. Despite this, no penicillin was administered to the participants in this study, and the participants were not allowed to seek treatment at other facilities if they continued in the study. Over the course of 40 years, many of the participants unknowingly spread syphilis to their spouse and sexual partners, and subsequently children born from those relationships. And many participants eventually died because they never received treatment for the disease. This study was discontinued in 1972 when the experiment was discovered by the national press. The resulting outrage over the experiment led directly to the National Research Act of 1974 and the strict ethical guidelines for research on humans. Research using animal subjects. Many psychologists conduct research involving animal subjects. Often these researchers use rodents or birds as the subject of their experiments. The APA estimates that 90% of all animal research in psychology uses this species. Because many basic processes in animals are sufficiently similar to those in humans, these animals are often considered acceptable substitutes for research that would be considered unethical in human participants. This does not mean that animal researchers are immune to ethical concerns. Indeed, the humane and ethical treatment of animal research subjects is a critical aspect of this type of research. Researchers must design their experiments to minimize any pain or distress experienced by animals serving as research subjects. Whereas IRBs review research proposals that involve human participants, animal experimental proposals are reviewed by an institutional animal care and use committee. An IACUC consists of institutional administrators, scientists, veterinaries, and community members. This committee is charged with ensuring that all experimental proposals require the humane treatment of animal research subjects. It also conducts semi-annual inspections of all animal facilities to ensure that the research protocols are being followed. No animal research project can proceed without the committee's approval. Scientific literacy. Knowing more about the scientific process, methods, and ethics can help you to become more informed about how to interpret information you may come across. It can also help you learn more about how to apply science to thriving in your own life. Trying to determine which theories are and are not accepted by the scientific community can be difficult, especially in an area of research as broad as psychology. More than ever before, we have an incredible amount of information at our fingertips, and a simple internet search on any given research topic might result in a number of contradictory studies. In these cases, we are witnessing the scientific community going through the process of reaching a consensus, and it could be quite some time before a consensus emerges. In the meantime, we should strive to think critically about the information we encounter by exercising a degree of healthy skepticism. When someone makes a claim, we should examine the claim from a number of different perspectives. What is the expertise of the person making the claim? What might they gain if the claim is valid? Does the claim seem justified given the evidence? And what do other researchers think of the claim? This is especially important when we consider how much information in advertising campaigns and on the internet claims to be based on scientific evidence, when in actuality it is a belief or perspective of just a few individuals trying to sell a product or draw attention to their perspectives. We should be informed consumers of the information made available to us because decisions based on this information have significant consequences. One such consequence can be seen in politics and public policy. Imagine that you've been elected as the governor of your state. One of your responsibilities is to manage the state budget and determine how to best spend your constituents' tax dollars. As the new governor, you need to decide whether to continue funding early intervention programs. These programs are designed to help children who come from low-income backgrounds, have unique needs, or face other disadvantages. These programs may involve providing a wide variety of services to maximize the children's development and position them for optimal levels of success in school and later in life. While such programs sound appealing, while not all programs are equally effective and the short-term effects of many such programs are more pronounced, there is reason to believe that many of these programs produce long-term benefits for participants. If you are committed to being a good steward of taxpayer money, you would want to look at research. Which programs are most effective? What characteristics of these programs make them effective? Which programs promote the best outcomes? After examining the research, you would be best equipped to make decisions about which programs to fund. Evaluating information sources. Every day we are flooded with information from a variety of sources. Your uncle sends you a link to a news story about the rise of violent crime in your area. A friend shares a social media post about a quick way to build muscle. You follow claims inflation is the highest it's ever been, while the New York Times says the economy has recovered and shows sign of strength. How do you evaluate these various claims? Which can you trust and act on? Since none of us are experts in all these fields, we rely on information shared by others daily. Are there strategies for efficiently doing so? First, consider how people assess information. We're more likely to believe messages from a social group we belong to, respect, or identify with. Trustworthiness also grows through repetition. The more times we hear something, whether true or not, the more likely we are to believe it, which is how advertising works. We are also motivated to believe what we hear when aroused by fear or other heightened emotions. Taken together, these yardsticks raise the possibility of trusting false information. One key strategy to assess the trustworthiness of information is to examine the source. Following are some general considerations. Is the information based on science? A community of scientists across hundreds of disciplines and around the world adhere to the principles of the scientific process. Scientific reports rely on the consensus and peer review of experts and are open to correction based on any new information that challenges it. Have the authors and or publisher of the information acknowledged up front any political, financial, or even ideological interest they may have? If so, this disclosure helps you assess their trustworthiness. The About Us section on a website is a great way to learn this information. Is the information as applicable and accurate as it can be? In the United States and Canada, for example, legal, ethical, and practical considerations mean that information coming from .gov and .ca, respectively, are oftentimes trustworthy. Educational and nonprofit institutions are another good source of information. These operate under public visibility and scrutiny, and their scholars are guided by scientific principles. Trustworthy sources in nonprofit agencies include government, think tanks, news organizations, professional associations of experts, foundations, and advisory panels to government agencies. As scientists who study human change and growth across the lifespan, developmental researchers often have application as their primary goal when researching a topic. So, although developmental psychology examines answers to philosophical questions like what does it mean to have a meaningful life, ultimately this is a field concerned with the practical. Developmental psychology is composed of many publications over several decades and from researchers across the globe. The theories and findings you learn about across this course often make use of a wide range of research methods, designs, and statistical analyses using many different groups of people. Researchers also use different tools before coming to a scientific consensus, including things like neurological measures, physiological measures, observations of individuals or families, and psychological measures. By putting all of these together, we can begin to form one practical example of developmental psychology's contribution to society is the shift away from the corporal punishment of children to promote healthier parent-child relationships. This study used a meta-analysis, a way of combining many different research studies to test a hypothesis to demonstrate that corporal punishment is not beneficial to children. In this course, you will learn about many historical findings, current studies, and topics that need further research as developmental psychologists strive to make contributions that impact our everyday lives.